Awesome. Well,
Technology, you see,
yeah,
you're
technology.
a young man, man. It's the
Yes.
problem I have is I usually got so many things open that I sometimes can't work out where they are. So
Well,
this is
yeah. Yeah, probably. But you're having your blog, and you still, you joined all kinds of different podcasts. So you're still have to be quite familiar with all this technology, aren't you?
yeah. Well, I mean, I tend to use Zoom. But it's Microsoft. The problem with Microsoft, it tends to take over your computer in different
Oh,
ways,
right.
and then it sends things to places that you're not necessarily familiar with.
Hmm.
So I just opened a couple of other things. I was changing a password for some stupid thing, which and then this got stuck with that.
Right.
Although I didn't ask it to, so until I opened that up, I couldn't see it. So anyway, there we are.
Well, yeah, awesome. Thanks again for coming on. It's good to have you back.
All right. Well, I'm still got it. I'm not 100%. I've got this cold and cough. It's just driving me mad, but it's a bit better than it was last week. Last week I felt terrible, but this week I
Obviously.
feel
Yeah,
I feel
but
a bit more human. So,
so you
and
you
it's
feel better
a
now.
sunny day. We have a
Awesome.
sunny day, so I'm happier. Good.
Awesome. Yeah, sun is good. We'll come to that
Good.
later. Why sun is exceptionally good when it comes to our cardiovascular health.
Oh, well, it's true. Yeah.
Right. Trace again, probably we'll come back to nitric oxide and everything that has to do with that. We'll cover
Yeah, we
that
can.
topic. It's a pretty fun one. I was have to tell you that interesting story because I was invited to another podcast from a good friend of mine, and we also talked about atherosclerosis and heart disease, and uh, I tried to present your kind of hypothesis that you lay down in your book as accurate and yeah, as accurate as I could, uh, but also accessible for other people. So that's not too complicated. I hope that
Yeah,
I
yeah.
made a reasonable job of that. And yeah, I made some shout outs to you, and I was referring back to your shirt that I saw you once wearing on I don't know, on a podcast probably that was with Ivor Cummins, I believe to
Yeah,
recall, which says say yes to no. So that was quite hilarious. That
yeah. Yeah, so, well,
was a
it's
good
just
one.
yeah, it's my anyway. Take it off in the sun, of course, so no one ever sees it.
Right, right. So where did we stop last time? If, for people maybe who I don't know would are not familiar with the things that we spoke last time about, it was mostly about questions regarding the whole narrative behind LDL kind of passing the endothelium, or what's the explanation for LDL getting stuck in the artery wall? Kind of how can that
Yeah,
happen? And we talked about how this is not possible if we look at physiological mechanisms, and we assessed different possibilities that could explain how or different possibilities that are usually proposed, about how LDL is getting driven into the artery wall. Okay, and before we maybe come to talk about your hypothesis or what you lay out in your book, I would still like to talk about some of the things that the mainstream medical narrative kind of is presenting to the medical community and to medical students, etc., and kind of ask some devil's advocate questions, because
yeah,
I believe that's what we should do if we're good scientists. We spoke about that last time,
absolutely.
right? And okay, so oftentimes when I talk to people about that, or when I was listening to these debates, so I've listened to a bunch of different debates between these two sides, one arguing for the lipid hypothesis, one arguing against it. There's always a couple of points that came up from the side of pro lipid hypothesis. And okay, so one of them clearly refers to epidemiological studies. That's kind of the starting point. We can look at epidemiology and then generate hypotheses and then test these hypotheses. And so it's pretty reasonable to assume that someone looking at this from the outside, who's not familiar with RCTs and more rigorously designed studies, could just say, okay, so we have these epidemiological studies which tell us that LDL is generally accepted, that higher LDL is kind of associated with increased cardiovascular risk. And so one could say, okay, so what could be an explanation for that? What would you say?
Well, I think I'll stop you slightly and say
Okay.
that I mean, obviously, I've written papers. In fact, there's another paper that I'm in the midst of writing
Right.
with a couple of other authors about. It's actually about familial hypercholesterolemia, which is very high levels of LDL, and perhaps it's a good idea to focus there because this is the area where people say the evidence is strongest, because people with familial hypercholesterolemia, which means it should be called familial hyper LDLemia because it is LDL. This is not cholesterol. Cholesterol and LDL are not the same thing, but the
Talked about that
usual.
last time, yeah.
So with LDL in FH, the LDL is normally about twice, although the definition of FH changes constantly. But in general, if the normal LDL is about 3 millimoles per liter, in familial hypercholesterolemia, it's going to be 6 or above, approximately. Although trying to pin anyone down as to what FH might actually be is a complicated thing.
And then we also need to distinguish between homogeneous FH and...
Oh, yeah. Well, I think to an extent, I'm going to leave homogeneous.
Yes, exactly.
Both genetic copies from a genetic copy from both parents. It affects about 1 in a million children. And whilst there is no doubt these children die.
And we can absolutely not draw any conclusions from this observation, because I believe that's what the medical community has to be very careful in doing, because oftentimes they conflate genetical anomalies with physiological processes. We simply cannot do that because the metabolism doesn't work properly if we have certain genetical kind of defects,
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of things going on with homozygous where your LDL might be 30 or 40. I mean, you can imagine any other substance in the blood reach 30 or 40 times normal, you'd have died within about 2 microseconds. Imagine if your sodium was 30 times normal, you wouldn't be lasting long. I don't think we can draw any conclusions from this. I was trying to think of any substance in the blood that could reach 30 times normal and you would still be alive. I think I came up with
well, it depends on how long you would be alive.
Well, it depends how long you would be alive.
Right. Like you can be alive for a while with...
Like, looking at these people, I think we'll leave it to one side.
Right.
There's a whole different discussion as to what actually goes on there, but you can't draw any conclusions. So what we're talking about, people with one gene, if you like, which basically means you've got less LDL receptors, or they don't work so well, or there's many different forms of familial hypercholesterolemia, which is important for the discussion.
Yeah.
And in general, there's a review of familial hypercholesterolemia that's been going on for a long time in the UK called the Simon Broom Registry, which started in the 70s, I think, and they followed people who they found have got familial hypercholesterolemia to see what's happened to them. And the general findings are fascinating. There is definitely a small subset of this population who die young of cardiovascular disease.
Yes. In
their 30s and 40s. And this has been used to say that familial hypercholesterolemia increases your risk of dying of heart disease by, in this case, 400 to 500%, which is very high. But of course, if you go down and drill down into the figures themselves, what you're looking at is about 3 individuals versus about 12 individuals.
Right, because it's for young people.
The absolute figures are vanishingly small. When you look at the larger population, the life expectancy and the cardiovascular disease rate, once they've reached the age of about 50 or 60, and various reports report at different ages, then the cardiovascular disease rate is actually the same or slightly less than the surrounding population. So overall, the rate of cardiovascular disease is very similar to the surrounding population. And this is what they found. They did a study in the Netherlands where they tried to find people who they found people who had familial hypercholesterolemia. And then they went back and said, genetically they must have been related to these people in the past, and this person in the past, and this person in the past. So they went back and looked through records from about 1850, 150, 170 years ago, and said, well, did these people die young? They were looking at, they didn't know what they died of in that case, but they just their life expectancy. And what they found was that from the years about 1850 to about 1920, people with familial hypercholesterolemia lived longer than the surrounding population. From about 1920 to about 1960, there was an increased mortality rate in this population. And since then, it's about the same as the surrounding population. So the overall mortality rate, but there were strands because there's different forms of familial hypercholesterolemia. I think, by memory, they had 4 different types, which have different problems with the receptor and blah, 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 and whatever. But also, and they found that certain strands had quite different outcomes. Some of them lived longer, some of them lived shorter, some of them lived at the same time. And this points to a very interesting study. And in fact, around about the same time, in fact, before this, there was another study done in the Netherlands where they found people. I'll try and get this the right way around because I always get this the wrong way around. Is that they found that they looked for people who might have familial hypercholesterolemia first, all right? Because in general, what happens is people look for people with heart disease, and then ones with heart disease, they say, we've got familial hypercholesterolemia. And then they say, aha, there's a lot of these people, they have a higher proportion of people with heart disease who've got familial hypercholesterolemia than the surrounding population. But of course, there's a huge confounder because they haven't actually said, let's wipe this slate clean. Let's just try and find people who've got familial hypercholesterolemia and then see what's happened to their relatives. All right.
All right.
So you're looking at it the other way around, the correct way around, if you like. So they screened students in, I'm sure it was the Netherlands again, and then they found a number of them, not very many, had familial hypercholesterolemia. Then they asked the question, well, have your father or mother, or wherever this gene came from, what was the rate of cardiovascular disease in your relatives? All right. So they asked, normally it's like, have you got heart disease? Have you got familial hypercholesterolemia? All right. And this way they asked, have you got familial hypercholesterolemia? Any signs of heart disease? Yeah. And what they found was that actually the rate of heart disease in the younger people, these were students with familial hypercholesterolemia, in their parents was lower than the surrounding population. There weren't very many individuals, obviously, because familial hypercholesterolemia affects 1 in 500.
So let me see real quick if I got it right. So you found certain young people, test persons?
Say 20 years old.
20 years old, okay. And they wanted to test whether their relatives were at an increased risk.
They started by saying, have you got familial hypercholesterolemia?
Yes.
They knew nothing else. They just did the blood tests, all right?
And these young people, they didn't suffer from heart disease, just regular young people.
They had no underlying conditions.
No underlying conditions, just healthy young people.
Yeah, they were just young, healthy people as far as they knew. All right. So how many of you have got familial hypercholesterolemia? Okay.
Okay, and then they tried to assess whether the parents of these people that indeed had familial hypercholesterolemia, if they were at an increased risk of, dying, suffering from a heart attack.
No, the parents who themselves would have familial hypercholesterolemia, because it's a genetic condition.
Right. So they would have.
So you would expect to find that out of a sort of random testing, that whilst these people are only 20, they're not going to have heart disease at this age. That you would find it within their relatives or their parents.
Maybe they had an increased risk of heart attack, you might think.
Would they have an increased risk of heart attack? And this is doing it the other way around. Does this make sense to you?
It makes sense, okay. And so they try to find out whether the parents had an increased risk of heart attack, of heart disease, and the results were that this wasn't the case.
This wasn't the case.
Okay.
No. In other words, there was no association. Now, there's 2 interesting things about this study. Is that, first of all, it never got published, and I only ever found out about it because there was a letter in the BMJ from one of the people who had done this study, who, when people were talking about familial hypercholesterolemia, he wrote, and it was in the BMJ, that we actually did the study that you're asking and requesting, and we found there was no association taken from a naive population. Because the problem is always that you start by people who've already got heart disease, and then say, how many of you have got familial hypercholesterolemia? Now, that makes an assumption that the only thing that could be causing their heart disease is the familial hypercholesterolemia. But they could be carrying another genetic condition at the same time.
Okay. And so that was my question, basically, that I want to ask next, is what could be the explanation for this observation, that if we look retrospectively, so if we look at the outcome and then try to find out risk factors, that then we indeed see a higher prevalence of people with FH.
Yes. So what you find is and this is part of the paper that we are writing, is that the people who
Cool.
actually get the heart disease are the people who've got blood coagulation abnormalities.
Right.
And when you look at it more closely, the LDL receptor, which is the thing that takes the LDL out of the bloodstream, it doesn't just take LDL out of the bloodstream. It has other functions. And it is closely related. The LDL receptor is also closely related to the function and the removal in some people of factor VIII, which is a hugely important clotting factor, and other clotting factors, by the way. So you then go back to twin studies, if you like, and you say, okay, so let's look at twins. So one of them's got the high LDL because they got the gene, and the other twin doesn't have the high LDL because they didn't get the gene. All right, and then say what's the rate of heart disease in these people? It's exactly the same.
It's identical.
The LDL itself is not the predictor. The predictor is another gene that is associated with.
Right.
It's closely associated in the same kind of locus as the LDL receptor. So you actually have, if you look at it and remove the assumption, there's always been this assumption, it's the raised LDL that's the problem.
Right.
Let's say, no, maybe it's the lack of LDL receptors that's the problem. Not the LDL that's causing the problem, all right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
It makes absolute sense, yeah. And I'm also familiar with that.
This is the paper that we're currently writing.
Okay, and I'm familiar with a study, maybe you mentioned the study last time we were talking, that directly compared patients with familial hypercholesterolemia, that compared those that had a higher incidence of heart disease with patients that didn't suffer from heart disease for certain reasons. And they try to find out if there are any differences in serum markers of, I don't know what, like lipids, blood clotting factors, etc.
This was the UK Biobank study.
Exactly.
Which is looks at millions of people and then says, let's look at all the genetic markers, let's look at all the risk factors, because they link this to the general practice records in the UK. And they did a study and they looked at it and found what do we find is associated with coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease, or whichever term you want to use. And they could find no genetic markers. Actually, there was nothing. And what they also found was that the cholesterol level, which of course is not the LDL, but it's a closely associated thing, they could find no association between the LDL cholesterol level and cardiovascular disease.
In
so
FH patients.
Increments of 1 millimole per 1 millimole per liter risk increase or decrease, and how does that affect the risk? It's like the odds ratio of 1 being, as you know, average. So an odds ratio of 1 means you've got the same risk as everybody else.
Right.
And then you say, well, if you look at the population, you've got instead of having a cholesterol of 3, you've got a cholesterol of 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. What does that do to the increased risk? And the findings from the UK Biobank study were nothing. There was no change in risk. It stayed at 1. It was so close to 1, it was remarkable. It was 0.99 or something.
Right. So it's basically
1. Which is 1. All right?
It's 1, yeah.
And then there was another study done in the UK, which was looking at they took GP records, and then they looked at 46 different factors that were measured by general practitioners, some of which you would think have nothing to do with heart disease, like your gamma GT level or your whatever it was, some other liver enzyme level that people take, and all sorts of things. They said, right, let's do this, and they got about 500,000 records, and then they looked at what happened over the next 5 years. What happened? I think it was 5 or 10 years. I think it was 5 years. It might have been 10 years. So these things were all measured, 46 different factors. And 10 years later, they said, well, which one of them most closely associated with dying of cardiovascular disease on the death record? And out of 46 factors, coming in at 44 was LDL. Now, it was statistically insignificant. The increase in relative risk was 0.01. All right.
Well, there's basically no association. Okay.
No association. In fact, the strongest association, and I've never seen this association before the study, was with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.
Oh, right. I mentioned that in your book.
Right. All right. And I thought, well, how does chronic obstructive pulmonary disease cause cardiovascular disease, which I now know. At the time, I just looked at that and thought, why is that there?
Yeah.
You know, of course, they didn't, and the causal towards association thing, you can say, well, people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease are quite often smokers, or they've worked in polluted environments, or they've worked, there may be other reasons, but what they did was this AI machine learning thing, was they tried to remove, they do this thing where they take all these factors and then see which ones are left and remain as powerful factors remaining everything else, which I think is impossible if you don't actually know what the associations between the factors are.
Sure, you can never remove all confounders, and there'll be.
Well, and some confounding factors are the factor themselves. So it's like removing obesity from diabetes and saying, oh well, if you look at the raised blood sugar level, obesity is not an independent risk factor. He's saying, yes, but unless you're obese, you're not going to be diabetic. So you can't actually separate these. You can't treat these as separate things. Anyway, that's a statistical discussion which I have and people don't understand. But anyway. So when you say the epidemiological studies, you say, well, there's a huge paper from Japan, 119 pages long, which I have read. I didn't fall asleep more than 10 times, where they found that actually the association was inverse in Japan, that if you had a higher LDL level or cholesterol, because some studies do cholesterol, some do LDL, whichever way you looked at it, the rate of death from cardiovascular disease was the lowest in the highest groups.
Was it all-cause mortality though, or cardiovascular disease?
Both.
Well, okay. Okay, that's
and
interesting.
Of course, since cardiovascular disease causes about 40% of all deaths, it does become quite important for the overall mortality statistics. Yeah. So when people say to me the epidemiological studies, I go,
okay. So you say it's not consistent. There is heterogeneity. There's heterogeneity. We have studies like the Framingham Heart Study, which is oftentimes brought up and taught in medical school, being like, okay, so this is kind of the most important piece of evidence we have in order to show that, okay, we draw a certain hypothesis from this observation that we make, which is, higher LDL translates to higher risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah. Well, of course, I didn't study LDL in Framingham.
Oh, yeah, that's what actually cholesterol.
The total number of people involved in that study was 5,000, by the way, to start with. In Norway, they did a similar study. They did 50,000 people, and they carried it on for 10 years. And in fact, the authors of this book, The Hunt Study, wrote to me because they knew I was somewhat critical of the LDL hypothesis, and pointed out that for men, as the LDL went up, essentially this is total cholesterol, which is like the Framingham study, when the total cholesterol was at 7 rather than 5, the increased risk of ischemic heart disease, as they called it, was about 5% increased. For women, it was 40% lower. So now at a cholesterol of 7, it was 40% less than it was at 5. So what they did, they arbitrarily set the odds ratio at 1 with a cholesterol of 5, and then said what happens as it goes up, just as a comparison. For men, it wobbled about, went up very slightly. For women, it dropped. Crazy. So you were less likely to die of ischemic heart disease as a woman with an LDL with a cholesterol of 7 than you were at 5.
And again, this doesn't necessarily prove that it protects you from heart disease, but it actually is a good piece of evidence to bring up if you want to make the argument that LDL is clearly or cannot clearly be the major cause or factor in causing heart disease. It's like imagine you'd have an epidemiological.
You're right. I mean, proving is tricky.
Exactly.
Proving is easy.
But imagine it's the example that Dave Feldman oftentimes brings up in these studies. Imagine you'd have a cohort which shows that the more smoking you have, the less you risk of developing lung cancer. And if we suggest that smoking is the primary cause of lung cancer, then this association would never make any sense whatsoever. And so if we propose that, okay, so LDL is the major cause and the most important factor in this pathophysiology, then this inverse association would never make any sense.
No, well, right? Of course, it's the Poparian Logic, which is you can find studies with associations. And what the general view is, and I've spoken to epidemiologists because I did write in a book called Doctoring Data about the fact that observational studies can't prove a hypothesis, and they wrote to me very upset and went, actually, that's not true. Because, of course, smoking was proven by an observational study. It was never proven with randomized controlled trial.
Yeah.
However, the association was so strong, it was something like 16-fold increase in risk. At that point, you can say, you know what, whatever the confounding factors may be, we've got it. All right.
Exactly.
It'd be like, you know, so if you get an association with the odd, it's got to be at least a doubling of risk or a halving of risk in an observational study, which is basically you just look at two groups of people and say what happened to them before you can even start to say this might be close to proof. Others say it's got to be 4 times as high or 5 times as high or whatever it is. But yes, when you see a lack of association, that is disproof.
Exactly.
And you know, the Framingham study itself, while it is held up as demonstrating an association, what they found was, and it was never directly published, but it was something we published, was that those people whose cholesterol, they didn't measure LDL at this time, those people whose cholesterol fell during the first 20 to 25, I think it was 20 years of the study, the rate of cardiovascular disease death in these people rose very considerably. So the association was actually that the falling cholesterol level was the strongest risk factor for dying from cardiovascular disease. Make of that what you will. But there was a huge study done in Austria. It was actually done on how many people was it? It was 180,000. I think it might be more than that. Maybe a quarter of a million over 20 years. And this is an overall mortality study where they looked at they looked at cholesterol levels when people aged from about 18 to 90. So you can imagine if you start a study when people are 90, not many of them are left 20 years later. But what they found again was that a high cholesterol was protective against overall mortality in all age groups.
Okay, so one devil's advocate question to that, because oftentimes I like this argument actually, but people oftentimes like saying that okay, so we could say that this can be explained by reverse causality.
No.
People that have disease experience a drop in LDL. And for me, it's difficult to understand which of these two arguments is more valid in this situation. If we say, okay, so look, we have older people, and it seems like those who experience a drop in LDL die sooner. Is this the correct line of reasoning?
Well, I mean, there's an argument there first proposed about 30 years ago, the reverse causality argument by Stamler. He had no evidence to support this, and it is correct that in the very late stages of there's liver failure,
or like cancer, isn't it? Also
cancer, but your cholesterol doesn't drop in cancer until the last few months, if at all. In liver failure, for certain forms of hepatitis can cause chronic liver failure that can do this. So in certain populations, so you can remove them, and this has been done.
Okay.
So what they did in the Japanese studies, they said, well, we took everybody out of our figures that we removed the sort of last 2 years of the cholesterol figures. So we only looked at people. There is no disease that can lower your cholesterol level 5 years before you die. They don't exist.
Okay. Oh, so these diseases that drop your cholesterol significantly do this exactly before you die, basically. You die from these diseases.
Yeah. Not even then, no one's actually done this study. This is just a hypothesis. It's never been proven, this hypothesis.
Okay.
And this cholesterol level is another one about, people always have a heart attack, have a lower cholesterol, which is why people admitted to hospital have lower LDL levels than people who don't. I said, what? So you have a heart attack and half an hour later your cholesterol levels dropped. But
they
come up with these ideas that are they're basically just desperate attempts. But
isn't it the idea that
people have looked at this reverse causality hypothesis and removed everybody from their figures from like the previous year, 2 years, or 5 years, and the figures still come out the same. So the reverse causality hypothesis is not supported by the research evidence.
No matter if you walk back in time, it still holds true.
Yes.
Okay. And I want to circle back for a second to the thing you mentioned with the LDL drop after a heart attack. Right. Yeah. So I believe you mentioned a study last time, and I'm well familiar with that study too. That people that they were taken in the hospital with a heart attack. There was a big proportion of those patients that had an LDL that was considered below average, and so you might say, okay, so there are these people that try to make the argument that it's the heart attack that drops the LDL.
Yeah, well, they didn't in this paper, but I have seen the argument made.
Right. And isn't there this mechanism? Like, I thought this is a true thing that happens.
Well, what is the mechanism?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, neither do I. Neither does anyone who says it happens.
Okay.
It just happens, all right? I mean, your sodium level doesn't drop when you have a heart attack. But somehow or other, your LDL level drops. Just as you're having in the peri-heart attack period, your LDL level drops. Yeah, well, why? And have you any evidence?
Okay, so you believe there's no clear evidence to suggest that your LDL levels actually drops after a heart attack? Or
no?
Okay.
I mean, why would it?
Well, yeah, maybe to repair a tissue. So it's a good player in that sense. I don't know.
Well, yeah, you can come up with all sorts of ideas. That's the joy of science. Here's a hypothesis. I don't need any evidence to support it. The reverse causality hypothesis there was no evidence to support it.
Right.
It was just thrown out there, and then it's a bit like the females are protected by, women are protected by female sex hormones hypothesis, because there was no other way of explaining why women had lower rates of cardiovascular disease than men. So this was like, oh, well, it's their sex hormones. And look at what happens after the menopause, and everyone just accepted it. It became an accepted fact.
Yeah, sure.
And
it's still taught in medical school.
Yes, well, I know. Yeah. Sorry, you've got the phone ringing in the background. I should do.
Don't worry.
Right. Sorry about that. Should have got rid of my phone. What you'll find, I mean, there's another one here. It's relevant to heart disease because it's the 5 portions of fruit and vegetables. Everyone knows that 5 portions of fruit and vegetables protect against heart disease. You find, where is the evidence for that? It doesn't exist. It was just stated. I've looked for this. Many people have looked for this. There is no evidence to support this. Yet it is now stated as a fact.
Right. And whenever you will now try to make an epidemiological study to support that, then you will always come up with the result that yes, those who eat more fruits and vegetables indeed have a low risk of heart disease. And now there's this whole healthy user bias issue, since those that eat more fruits and vegetables do other healthy things, and so clearly they will have a lower risk.
You're told it's healthy, so healthy people do it, and then they find that yes, amazingly enough, it's healthy. I mean, this is always the problem with the observer effect. You say to people, if you do this is healthy, and the people who are naturally healthy and do healthy things do it, and then we go back and say, you see, we proved it all along, it is healthy. I mean, it's just rubbish.
Yeah.
So when people say there's epidemiological evidence to support the fact that people with have higher cholesterol or LDL are more likely to die of cardiovascular disease, I would say to them, well, I've studied this area for many, many years. I can't find this evidence. I was involved in writing a paper 2 years ago where we looked at the LDL levels, and they're not always measured in population. So there weren't that many studies. It was 19 studies where the LDL was measured and was related to cardiovascular disease. There was no association. There was an inverse association. So when people talk to me about epidemiology, I say, well, you could go out then and do the epidemiology like I did, and you'll find that this association that you claim does not exist. Even when you look at familial hypercholesterolemia, the association is within a small subset of young people. It has been known for years. I have a study from 1966 that looked at, because the problem you have in the more recent studies is, of course, everyone with high cholesterol or LDL is prescribed a statin, which lowers it. So you can almost tell nothing anymore about high or low cholesterol levels and what they do, because we've adjusted the LDL level of a huge proportion of the population, especially those who had a high level to start with. So those with a high level, some of them have a low level. So if you
Right.
say that a low level causes this or a high level causes that, you go, well, yeah, but they're all
What
on
is what?
medications to adjust this. I
Exactly.
don't know. I mean, no, that is a confounding factor. So the studies, if you look back in time, are often valid because there was nothing they weren't taking LDL or cholesterol lowering medications because they couldn't, because there wasn't any that were very
What
effective.
criticism did you run into with your paper that you just mentioned with the 19 studies that showed an inverse association between LDL and all-cause mortality? Because I believe there was I don't know I don't know what it was, but maybe a paper, an article that I saw. I didn't read it, I believe,
Yeah, yeah,
that criticized the paper and what you mentioned
yeah,
there.
yeah. We got the criticism was there were three criticisms. One is we only searched in English,
Okay,
all right, which is what 99.9% of everybody always does.
good
Because
argument.
I don't know about you, but I find Russian, you're probably quite good at reading the German ones and the English ones, but we can't. We just didn't have the ability to
Sure.
look at papers that were published in all these different languages. And there are very few. Any major papers are published
Sure.
in English. We only use one database, which was the NIH PubMed database. Again, this is what 99.999% of researchers do, because it's just everything is there. If it's
Exactly.
not there might be some study that was done in, I don't know, Guatemala or something that is really important. It was never
Okay.
published in English and wasn't published and never made it to PubMed. So essentially, these are just ridiculous criticism. And the other criticism was that that statins lower LDL and reduce the risk of heart disease. So we know that having a lower LDL is protective against heart disease. So, which is a completely different argument. And
Right.
that was it.
It doesn't disprove what you say. It doesn't make it
No.
less valid what you propose in your paper
Oh
by
yeah.
saying, okay, we have a completely different line of evidence which has nothing to do with what you just explained in your paper.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Interesting.
it's typical when you find that it's remarkably effective, though, if you attack, and people say, oh, there was criticisms of this paper, and you go, yes, but what were the criticisms? What? That we didn't look
Exactly.
at languages that weren't English, that we only used the biggest database that all researchers use and almost exclusively used, and that you've got some evidence that has
Right.
nothing to do with what we were saying.
Yeah.
But that's it.
Well,
That is
that's
your
a strawman
totality.
argument, the last one.
But however, all you need to say is experts around the world have criticized this paper. Well, then ask them, what were those criticisms and what impact does that actually have on the validity of this paper? And the answer is none. Just
Right.
none. But yet it's what they call, in English, they call it going for the man and not for the ball. If you can't criticize the data, attack the person.
Oh man, yeah. We experienced that so vehemently over the past couple of years, especially. Like this has been extremely well, I experienced this myself, like people that try to discredit me as a person instead of criticizing what I was saying. I'd be like, "Okay,
Yeah.
what don't you like about what I say? Tell me what is wrong with information. Don't call me a conspiracy theorist. Tell me what is wrong
Yeah.
with information." And it's so easy for people to just I don't know, throw away that responsibility to engage in an actual conversation and discussion by labeling that person a horrible name, something like
Yeah.
right wing, conspiracy theorist, denier. Anything that is
Oh
denier
yeah.
is
Well,
automatically
yes.
bad, and then you
I
don't
mean,
even have to talk to that
I'm
person.
I'm a statin denier. I don't deny they exist. I'm a cholesterol denier. I'm a whatever. Don't worry, I've had it all. Many
Heart
times.
disease
And it's like
denier.
you said, there's no point because it works. It's remarkably effective saying, "Oh, this
Sure.
person doesn't believe in whatever." It's
Yeah.
like, well, I'm a scientist. I don't believe in anything. Show me the evidence, please,
Beautiful.
and I'll look at it for you. But
Beautiful.
it work. I mean, it's sad that it appears to work.
Oh,
Someone can say,
absolutely.
and if you make one mistake, the tiniest mistake,
Right.
or even if it's not a mistake, like in this case, we didn't look at studies that weren't published in English. It's not a mistake. That's just we couldn't. We didn't have the
Right.
resources to do that. And we said, well, it's pretty unlikely that anything of any. It's not like they said, aha, you didn't look at this database, and we found 10 studies in this database that show that you're wrong. And you go, fine, okay, that's good. Show me what evidence are you criticizing us on?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they had no criticism of the actual evidence or our analysis of the evidence or what the evidence suggested.
Right.
Because they couldn't, because there isn't any. I know, and I've had a lot of people asking me, how do you analyze clinical papers? What do you look for? I said, what I look for, the most important thing to look for in any clinical paper, the absolutely critical, most important fact is, what does it not say?
Yeah.
All right. What should it be saying and it doesn't say? So if a paper does not say there was a decrease in overall mortality, that means they couldn't find any. If the paper does not say there was a reduction in cardiovascular mortality, that's because there wasn't any. It's a very simple test. Because
Interesting.
you can bet all the money in the world that if there was a difference, that would be the number one thing highlighted on the paper.
Do you believe
So
that would
when
still be
someone,
the number one thing that they would point out if it was, for instance, in a context of an epidemiological study that was looking at LDL and all-cause mortality? Do you still believe that the number one thing that they would point out is that there is an decreased risk of all-cause mortality
well, of
because that
course they
was
would, because
run
yeah,
contrary to the mainstream narrative?
because that's the absolutely most important thing, isn't it? Because
It
all the
is.
other things,
Technically, that's true.
are subject to bias. There's one form or another.
Sure.
I mean, even death certification is subject to bias.
Oh,
So
clearly.
as we know. So I mean, it is like when it came to the COVID epidemic, the only data that I look at and go back to is called EuroMOMO, European Monitoring of Overall Mortality, or whatever the MOMO stands for. And I say I don't care because at the moment in the UK, for instance, we're apparently having 200 excess deaths per day from COVID. If you go and look at the overall mortality statistics, there's no sign of anything happening at all.
Okay.
So to me, that's the important data. There's a dichotomy there. If we really were having 200 excess deaths from COVID a day, this would be showing as a major increase in overall mortality
Right.
from standard levels. But we're not seeing that.
Exactly.
So I'm thinking, right, that's interesting. So when it comes to heart disease and statistics and LDL, I go, what's the overall mortality doing here? Because if that's unchanged, whatever else you're telling me about is of very little importance. If you take a statin, for example, if it prevents a non-fatal heart attack, well, that's quite a good thing, although it may be balanced by other negative effects. But if you're having no effect on my life expectancy, if I take a statin for 5 years and I live not 1 day longer, what is the point?
Right.
Well, the actual statistic is if you take a statin, and this is from assuming the clinical trials are correct, the actual statistic is if you take a statin for 5 years and you don't have any underlying cardiovascular disease to start with, the increase in life expectancy is 3 days. So that means you take a statin for 5 years and you live for 3 days longer on average.
It's primary prevention, isn't it?
Sorry?
Primary prevention.
Primary prevention.
Primary.
Secondary prevention is 4.1 days.
Beautiful.
So that's 0.75 of a day gained for every year of taking a statin. Now, you might think that's worthwhile. You might not think that's worthwhile. I have no idea what people think is worthwhile or not. But I can at least give them the data and say, that is the increase in your life expectancy. And then people say, oh, well, but the statin trials only lasted 5 years, and if you took them for more years, you would live. The benefit
10
would be even
days.
greater. So, well, first of all, you can't say that because you don't have the evidence. And secondly, well, let's say you take it for 30 years, what are you going to get? Instead of 4 days, you're going to get 24 days a month. So you take a statin for 30 years and you might get a month, assuming the benefit continues for the next 25 years.
And assuming that this is the actual benefit that was actually, I don't know, the result of the study, because you still need to consider all the biases that are associated with studies that are being conducted by pharmacological influences.
Well, of course, there. I mean, there is only a statistic I like, or a fact I like to use it, is out of all the major statin trials at the time, 26, I think they were, placebo controls. You can't really do placebo controlled trials anymore. because it's considered unethical. But anyway, of the 26 major placebo-controlled statin trials done, one showed no benefit at all. There are actually others that didn't, but then they punched them. But anyway, one. And that was done not by a pharmaceutical company. That was done by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And it was the ALLHAT LLT study. ALLHAT standing for something or other. I can't remember. An LLT stand for lipid lowering trial using pravastatin. And they found no benefit on cardiovascular or overall mortality outcomes from taking pravastatin for 5 years. All of the pharmaceutical company studies showed a benefit. Interestingly, since the new regulations on trial reporting came in 2005, there has not been a single positive statin trial.
Before that?
No, after that.
So what was this new regulation? What was it about?
Oh, you never heard of the new regulation?
I've heard of that, but I can't quite articulate it well enough.
There was a thing, well, prior to 2005, in fact, for most of medical research history, if you did a study and it didn't prove positive, there was no requirement for you even to say that you did it. So you could just bury it. Right. Equally, there was no requirement to say what are the outcomes we're going to look for. So you could just, if you started to find that it wasn't proving that your outcome was positive, you could just say, oh, well, look at something else. So you could change your statistical analysis. You could even change the number of participants in the trial halfway through. You could change what you're doing, and you could change the dosages as well. You could do it. Essentially, you could do anything you like to get statistical significance. Okay.
Jesus.
And then a study in America was they looked at studies and found that if people reported what they were going to study beforehand, what statistical analysis they were going to use, off the top of my head, the number of positive trials went from 80% to 20%. Right.
After implementing the new regulation that would prohibit these things.
This is probably why it was implemented. So they then said, right, well, we're going to introduce these new requirements for pharmaceutical companies. Came in 2005 in Europe, and 2004 in the States, I think. And so there's a thing called clinicaltrials.gov where you have to register your trial.
Right.
I mean, in theory, you have to register your trial, although, anyway. So you have to say, this is our trial. This is how many people we're looking at. These are the outcomes we're looking at. These are the statistical analysis we're going to use. Blah, blah, blah. Right. And then if you make changes to that, it has to be recorded and reported. So it's not a perfect system, but it is a slightly improved system.
Sure.
Put it that way. So before 2005, we had a whole bunch of very positive statin trials. After 2005, we have none. Surprise, surprise. You know. So this requirements that changed have really counteracted the benefits of statins that we've seen in this trial.
So after 2005, there hasn't been any research done on statins that showed positive outcomes in terms of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you can draw a graph. In fact, it wasn't myself. It was a cardiologist in France called Michel Delogereau, who you may have heard of, who ran the Leon Heart study, which is the one that started the whole Mediterranean diet thing, who I communicate with regularly and write papers with. Anyway, he looked at it and has written a part of the paper which says, here is, draw a line at 2005, draw lots of dots from studies before 2005 and draw the dots after 2005. What do we find? Oh, look, there's nothing showing up.
The ridiculous drop in efficacy.
It must be amazing. It must be something that happened in 2005 to the world.
What could that be?
Ultraviolet rays from the sun or something. Or else perhaps, the results are now correct and the ones before are not. The problem you have, of course, is that nowadays it's impossible to go back and do these trials again. It's a huge problem we have. It's reproducibility in clinical studies. And it's made even worse with the statin study, because if you get 40,000 people studied for 5 years on a trial that cost you $300 million to do, who the hell is ever going to do that again? And of course, the other problem is you're not going to be able to put no one on it. You can't have somebody on a placebo anymore. Because
that's unethical.
Crazy. So these trials, de facto, you're never going to do this trial again. You're not even allowed to do this trial again.
It's considered unethical. It's considered unethical to not put someone on a statin if that person is of an increased risk of cardiovascular disease.
That's right. Yes. So you can't have a placebo arm anymore.
Yeah.
Which is one of the problems, of course, is that they find it more and more difficult to find placebo groups to study with statins because, the first studies done, they didn't know that it worked. So to study the 4S study, the Scandinavian simvastatin something study, and the West of Scotland trials, which were the first primary and secondary care studies, they could say, let's see what happens. Statin, placebo. Now it has to be a group that we don't really know that we get benefit in, so statin versus placebo. Or you can look at subgroup analysis and stuff like this. So essentially, we can't do these trials again. We never can.
We can't.
And of course, the other thing is so fascinating is that when they did say the West of Scotland clinical study, the rate of heart disease in Scotland at that time was 5 times what it currently is.
Mm-hmm.
So any benefit that you may have got then would have to be divided by 5 now. It never achieved statistical significance for overall mortality.
I see.
But anyway, the statistical significance will probably be gone from all other parts of that study as well. Because you'd have to divide everything by 5, which is also why when they look at the risk factor calculators that we have, and they say, what's your risk of dying of heart disease? They're based on these data from like 40 years ago.
Where the risk was much higher based on things that we know or maybe not.
Well, we may know or maybe not. In the west coast of Scotland in the early 80s, which was when the Wascott study was started, the rate of heart disease in men, when it was only a study in men, they were only done in men, was literally 5 times as high as it is now. So you can't find that population again either.
Yes.
They're not there.
Yes. Why do you believe the risk, the incidence or prevalence of heart disease was so much higher back then, though?
Well, I think there was a number of factors. I discussed them in part in my book. I think there was an awful lot more smoking, which is clearly a risk.
Smoking is a major one.
There was a major issue to do with what I call psychosocial stress in that.
Right.
In that area of Scotland, there was a huge movement of people from central Glasgow, and they moved them into these lovely new towns and broke up quite a lot of the social ties that people had. There was a lot more also just general pollution going on. There was lead still in petrol, which was being pumped out into the atmosphere, which...
so this also went down, okay.
Etc., etc. I mean, you can say... I mean, you have to remember that in the 1960s to 70s, the rate of heart disease in America, USA, fell. And the authorities had no idea why, because there was no explanation for this. So they set up a thing called the Monitoring Cardiovascular Disease Study, which then came over to Europe to try and find out why is the rate of heart disease falling when the rate of risk factors is not. And they never got an explanation. Because at that time, and they've now fudged it and they've said it's because of this, that, and the next thing. But actually, if you look at the actual Monica study that was actually reported in 1998, I think, and the person who ran it was called Hugh Tunstall Pedo. And what they found from the 2 clear key findings, which were one of them was explicable, the other one wasn't. They couldn't find any connection between cholesterol levels and heart disease.
Because it didn't change, probably.
Didn't change. Well, it was beginning to go down because the statins were being introduced. And they couldn't find any association with smoking either.
Oh, wow.
None. So, yeah, that surprised you, stunned you anyway. But the Monica study, they couldn't find the standard risk factors made no difference to the rates of heart disease across Europe. And they just drew a veil over it, virtually, they said.
We don't know.
And then just carried on. You know, it's
paradox. It's a paradox.
It's a paradox, yeah. The paradox is 35 countries and 600 million people is a paradox. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's so funny, right?
Anyway,
anything that doesn't fit the model is just being, labeled paradox, and then you're done with that.
It was the biggest ever study carried out by the World Health Organization. I think it remains the biggest study.
Right.
They were carried out and funded by the World Health Organization. And they were just left without any explanation for anything. They just couldn't explain it.
Did you come up with any explanations?
Sorry?
Were you able to come up with any explanation for that?
Well, yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
So
that's quite a long explanation.
It's a long explanation, but maybe if you could summarize in a couple of sentences.
Well,
What
I
could be
think
a
that
possible could be a possible way
one of
to
the things
explain that
is
observation?
currently, if you're going to say which countries in the world have the highest rates of heart disease, they are all, well, primarily they're ex-Soviet countries,
Right.
including countries like, surprise, surprise, Syria, Lebanon, countries that Yemen, countries that have enormous social upheaval and
Wow.
unrest. Now, if you look at say, well, why America was the first country to have a really high rate of heart disease, I think it's probably true even. You say, well, that was found after the Second World War. Well, the Second World War was a pretty major problem for a lot of people.
Oh, bet it was.
Caused a bit of social unrest. In America, they also had the Great Depression, and they were the first country to introduce, more and more people with cars that were all relying on leaded petrol, blowing 400,000 tons of lead was being blown into the atmosphere every year and being breathed in. Can you imagine? And a recent study 4 years ago looked actually at the impact of lead on cardiovascular disease. We found that historically it was causing 180,000 deaths a year still in the United States.
Yeah.
So pollution, war, upheaval. The next country in the world to have the highest rate of heart disease was Finland in the 1960s. They took over from America. So what happened in Finland? Well, using Ukraine as a current example, Russia invaded Finland before the Second World War. But then at the end of the Second World War, they said, we want a third of your country, called Karelia. And the Russians threw out 700,000 Finns out of Russia and into Karelia. The areas of Karelia called Kipo and North Karelia and South Karelia. A lot of them went into North Karelia. And outstandingly, of course, the rate of heart disease was very high. It was highest in North Karelia in the 1960s, in the 10, 15 years after this enormous social dislocation and upheaval occurred. And if you read the book, you'll also see, and notice to draw a graph of Finland, not Finland, Lithuania. The rates of heart disease are about 200. In 1981, I just started 1981 because that just happens to be when the statistics started for Neuro-Heartstat. And the rate of heart disease was kind of gradually falling. And then in 1989, which is when they had a revolution, the Russian tanks moved in. Their economy went through the floor. It was a complete disaster. Their rate of heart disease.
And then you had this massive spike, yeah.
Massive spike. I mean, it's like Mount Everest in the middle of the ground. When I first saw those figures, I thought, well, that's just rubbish. They obviously don't know how to do it. But actually, those figures come from the remnants of the Monica study, the Euro Heart Survey study. These were people who had been trained in defining heart disease definition of who died of heart disease. So the statistics are robust. So it comes along, 1989, rate of heart disease, whoop.
Right.
For about 3 or 4 years, and then comes down and then follows its previous graph. So what you have here is almost the perfect sort of encapsulation of if your country's economy and society and everything about it collapses, what happens to the rate of heart disease? That is what happens to the rate of heart disease.
Yeah.
You can look at Russia itself.
So damaging, yeah.
In fact, Russia is 2 years delayed. 1991 is when the spike in death rate from heart disease occurs in Russia. 2 years after Lithuania. What happened in 1991? Soviet Union disintegrated. Gorbachev was got rid of. Yeltsin, if you can remember all this, Yeltsin came in. The Russian economy went through the floor. People's pensions disappeared. This is when the Russian mafia moved in, and Yeltsin divided up Russia into, you can have 5 billion of resources there and whatever. It was a disaster.
So social chaos.
Heart disease went like that.
Social chaos, economical disasters, psychological strain, everything that has to do with that apparently has massive impacts on the incidence of heart disease, more than we ever might think.
Well, I think it is. I think it's a primary factor.
Right.
I'm showing a study from South America, South Africa, where they looked at people who had money worries. Men are more worried by money worries than women. And they found that people with significant financial concerns and difficulties, where in the period they examined them, 13 times more likely to have a heart attack. 1, 3, 13, that's huge. So the impact of stress, if you like, and if you look at a graph of countries and say, look at a graph, look at a picture of countries and then put in areas that are socially deprived versus areas that are rich and comfortable. The study in Glasgow, where there was two places, one called Galton and the other one called, I forgot the name of it now, which was a poor area, and the other one was a rich area of Glasgow, and they're 3 miles apart geographically, and the difference in life expectancy is 22 years.
Wow.
22 years.
Yeah, that's massive.
I mean, the life expectancy in Russia, once there was a breakdown, went dropped in men by 7 years.
Yeah, that's like something.
It's
not 5 days.
No, we're talking. I know the statin might have kept them alive.
Right.
No, but
it's not because they stopped taking statins.
Well, they didn't have statins in that time. And then the interesting thing about Russia is, of course, the rate started to fall, and then in 1999 it jumped up again. So what happened in 1999 was an enormous breakdown of the Russian economy. The ruble crashed. The savings were destroyed. At the same time, the heart disease rate went through the roof. So, you can look at a couple of other countries. There was a time in about 1960s when France and the Czech Republic had the same rate of heart disease, both low. In the Czech Republic, you remember there was a revolution in 68 and all that. By the time, 20 years later, the rate of cardiovascular disease death in younger men under 65 was 8 times as high as it was in France.
Wow.
What changed? What changed? It was societal. The communists came in, took over, they had a revolution, there was oppression, there was enormous psychosocial stress. I mean, I'd be interested to know what's going to happen in Ukraine, except at the moment, Ukraine has the highest rate of heart disease in Europe anyway. So God knows what's going to happen to them over the next not in ex-Soviet countries. I mean, the highest rate, I think it's something like Tajikistan or something like that, or Uzbekistan, or any of these ex-Soviet republics, just about, apart from the ones like Poland. Poland was the first of the Soviet countries to show a spike in heart disease rates, and that occurred at the time when they had, you may not remember this, but there was Lech Walesa and all that in Poland, who were the first to kind of start revolting against the Soviet authorities in the early 1980s.
Okay.
The heart disease rate went like that
in Poland
at the time. So they went first, and they went up first. So I mean, if you drew a graph of the world and said, where do you think you're going to have heart disease? It's like, well, find me a country that is really under enormous stress,
economical stress, social stress,
whatever. And I will find you a country that's got a high rate of heart disease, virtually.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable that you mentioned all that, because I realized that quite a big portion of your book is dedicated to explaining these observations and actually showing all these graphs. So it becomes quite clear from reading your book that you at least find this to be one of the major factors contributing to heart disease.
Yeah. At one time, I thought it was the factor.
Right.
So this is it. But then I thought, no, it's not it. But it's an important it, very important it. Your people, as I try to explain, it's a big issue I've had, because the trouble is you end up sounding like an aged hippie. You say that the mind and the body are connected, closely connected.
Oh yeah.
The mind-body connection, well, the duality, comes from Descartes, Cartesian duality. There is the mind and there is the body, and there is no connection between these two things. Western medicine has gone along this path. And then in dissociation, nothing happens to your mind can affect your body. But I mean, even I go back to the First World War, which is the first time when people started to recognize what they call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They used to call it shell shock, and people they couldn't move, they couldn't act, they were just done. They were called cowards and shock, of course. But, very, very pleasant. But these people in this state developed sugar in their urine. They had
Yes.
severe type 2 diabetes.
Crazy.
All right. So, and this was recognized that this terrific stress was actually creating. You say, well, how does being stressed cause type 2 diabetes? Well, just go through it very simply.
Mm-hmm.
When you're under stress, you release stress hormones.
Right.
Stress hormones being cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, glucagon,
Mm-hmm.
blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of them. And they're all designed to rev you up and get you ready for a fight. That's fine in the short term. You want that. You go on a roller coaster and everyone gets excited, and then it goes, and it's fine, and it's healthy, and it's probably a good thing to do. But what you don't want is those hormones to be raised all the time.
All the time.
Because if they're raised all the time, cortisol, for example, is directly antagonistic to insulin throughout the body. So if you have a high cortisol level, let's forget all the other hormones which are important.
Yes.
Now, a high cortisol level, you have got what they call insulin resistance, because insulin can't work so well because it's got cortisol attacking it.
Sure.
And at the same time, of course, your blood sugar levels is going to go up. They have this thing called post-traumatic, post-aggression stress, which means basically somebody in a car crash or shot or whatever. So it's a physical thing. So if you have a major surgery, your body is in a high stress or strained situation. Mm-hmm. And in these situations, your blood sugar levels can triple, quadruple, go up to 24, 25.
Well, that's basically what cortisol is partially responsible for. It liberates every energy substrate there is in your body, so that you can fight, so that you can run away, climb, I don't know, whatever, swim away, and it increases osteoclast activity, so that it liberates calcium, so that your muscles can contract. It liberates fatty acids. It liberates glucose. It increases gluconeogenesis. It increases lipogenesis, like everything. Just energy substrate availability.
That's what it does. So if you've got too much of this sloshing around in your body, that's fine in the short term. If you're having a fight, you need all this stuff.
Sure.
If you're boxing somebody or you're in Ukraine at the moment, but the trouble is when this becomes a chronic state, then your system starts to go into a terrible position.
Sure, and we see that in morbus Cushing, for instance. Like it directly induces morbus Cushing syndrome. It induces insulin resistant directly. That's kind of that's how you can actually realize see if that person actually has Cushing syndrome or not. Like this person is heavily insulin resistant.
Yes. Oh, exactly. Well, I mean, Cushing's disease itself.
Right.
Where the body produces too much cortisol from the adrenal gland, tumor or whatever. People with Cushing's disease, they have diabetes, they have thin bones,
exactly,
they have central obesity, they have high blood
all
pressure,
that,
they have increased clotting factors, they have high blood, they have. It's like, hold on, is this not a model that's good enough for you? And they have a vastly increased risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah.
If you take Cushing's disease and look at all the metabolic abnormalities, and then you take people who've got high levels of stress and anxiety, it's the same thing.
It's the same thing.
If you look at schizophrenia, which is probably the highest stress mental disorder that there is, you can actually see the pituitary gland is increased in size in schizophrenia, because they're constantly alert and worried and anxious about stuff. If you've got voices in your head saying kill everybody, you're going to be anxious. Right?
Yeah, perhaps.
Or everyone's trying to kill you. Whichever way around it. They live in a constant state of anxiety.
And that model is actually, it's good, really good to explain all the observations actually, because if we look at stress, at a stressful situation, that as we said, everything gets upregulated. Your blood becomes more procoagulant, because you might cut yourself, you might bleed, and you don't want to die. So why not increasing the coagulability of your blood while you're in a fight, for instance? Then whatever, like all these other hormones that induce insulin resistance, because you need substrate in the blood to be liberated. Okay, then we have what else do we have? Like, it disrupts. What else does this axis disrupt? Like we have certain sleep disruptions. It disrupts your entire hormonal system in your body.
Which is what I mean in these situations in schizophrenia, they basically die of heart disease. I mean, a lot of them commit suicide. But after that, the average life expectancy, you see, someone with schizophrenia is 49.
Mm-hmm.
If they take drugs and alcohol, which a lot of them do, to kind of calm their symptoms, it's 40.
Wow.
This is a disease that can halve your life expectancy,
Mm-hmm.
and it's because you're overdriving your anxiety and stress.
Mm-hmm.
You're a lot of these people develop diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
They take their atypical antipsychotics, which also affect glucose metabolism, and a huge number of them become diabetic.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see exactly the same effects in PTSD, although slightly milder. But PTSD, cortisol response is blunted, almost gone. The entire stress HPA system is knackered. Sorry, I've got my cough. And then when you look at the population in the world with the highest rates of heart disease, probably now, are Australian Aboriginals.
Mm.
And if you look at their strain or stress system, what you find is, and normally your cortisol goes up in the morning, drops down, and wobbles around a bit.
Right.
They're readying you for the day, if you like. With the Australian Aboriginals, they've measured cortisol levels in young men, and that morning peak is gone.
Right. So completely disrupted HPA axis.
Completely disrupted stress syndrome. I mean, it may not be cortisol itself at this point, because you've got all sorts of other things. You've got the sympathetic nervous system. You've got so basically, you've got a kind of mild Cushing's.
Yeah.
On your hands. And yes, they develop diabetes at a higher rate. They develop heart disease at a higher rate. They've got depression. They've got anxiety. They've got, you want to look at heart disease and say, what causes it? Australian Aboriginal men and women. Young Australian Aboriginal women have a heart disease rate 30 times greater.
Wow.
30 times greater than the surrounding population.
And now you could bring that up in front of any member of the medical community and say, so now explain me how this can be explained by the LDL lipid-hypothesis model. Tell me how this is possible. If LDL is the most important player, how can that be explained by that model?
They just say it's multifactorial.
Again, paradox. It's multifactorial. It's like all these fancy terms.
I'm gonna have to.
Are you
good?
Get
a glass of water. Give me 5 minutes.
Sure. So, you're good?
I told you I wasn't quite well yet.
Yeah.
Episodes, and I just go like it's turning me inside out.
Okay, so, no problem.
I'd step back and just say, I mean, Australian Aboriginals are, as you say, how does the LDL hypothesis explain that they have such a high rate of heart disease? Well, you can't through that hypothesis, but then you get this terrible argument that throws in front of you, which is always thrown in front of you. It's multifactorial.
Yes. That's just hilarious. It's same as saying it's a paradox. We just can't explain it, and then we'll just go into say we explain the observation by another observation. It's so stupid. It's so silly. Like, we have the observation they have in high risk and heart disease, and how do we explain this? Not by mentioning another explanation for that, but by stating just another observation. So we explain observation by an observation. Beautiful concept.
Well, it's I once described the cholesterol hypothesis as being like a cathedral. When they built cathedrals in the old days, they suddenly found that it was starting to collapse. So they built what they call a buttress to hold the wall. Mm-hmm. And then if that buttress wasn't big enough, they built another buttress on top of the buttress, which is called a flying buttress. All right, and you could keep your building kind of from collapsing so long as you kept supporting it in all directions. I said, well, it's like you built your cathedral in a bog. And it doesn't matter how many buttresses. Eventually, this whole thing is just going to go.
Right.
Whoop.
Okay.
But for now, it's a buttress. It's another. So if you follow these buttresses along, I mean, the female sex hormone was just a buttress. And then we have, it's not LDL, it's the LDL HDL ratio buttress.
Yes.
It's
small dense LDL.
It's small dense LDL buttress. Light fluffy LDL is protective buttress.
Yeah.
Well, actually, people's LDL falls just before they die buttress. It's, how many Karl Popper, who I read quite a lot of, philosopher, talk about scientific falsification, and he says you can. He calls them ad hoc hypotheses rather than buttresses, but essentially it's the same thing. It's like so. Okay, here's a contradiction. It's not really a contradiction because. Well, here's a contradiction to that contradiction. Well, that's not a contradiction because.
Exactly.
Because.
Exactly. That's so interesting. That's what I realized to be intrinsically true about any ideology. Because if you have an ideology, you're able to twist any argument that's supposed to counter your side around so that it now becomes a buttress and supports your ideology. It's remarkable.
Theology used to do the same. There's an all-knowing, all-caring God. Well, why does God allow people to die? Because.
Right.
Well, what about this? Because. What about this? Because. Because you can't allow the central ideology to die, so you just keep. Of course, in the end, they actually become contradictory to each other as you follow them down for long enough. But no one's really willing to do that because it's like you say, well, okay, so women don't get as much heart disease and they've got higher LDL levels. It's because of sex hormones. We found that sex hormones increase the risk of heart disease. It's because of something else. Well, what is it? Well, we don't know, but it must be. It's like a chap I was communicating with. He's 73 now, and he's got an LDL level of 19. He's been investigated very thoroughly. I don't know why, but they obviously found his LDL level, and then he tried him on statins, tried him on everything, and he doesn't like taking them because it doesn't deal with it very well. And they can find no evidence of any cardiovascular disease or atherosclerosis in any of his arteries in any part of his body. So instead of going, you know what? He's a paradox.
Sure. That's how simple it is.
He must be being protected by, you've got a question. He must be we know that LDL causes heart disease. So he must be being protected by something because he hasn't got any heart disease.
Yeah.
So what is it? When you find, there was when they said that HDL, high density lipoprotein, was protected, they found a population in Italy who had very low HDL levels genetically, who had no heart disease. So this is a kind of contradiction. He said, well, their HDL must be special HDL. Even though there's less of it, it's more powerful, right?
Special.
And they in fact found this substance, and they called it because it was near Milan. They called it Apo-A1 Milano HDL, all right? And they found it, and then they genetically made it in a lab. And then they injected it into people. He said, look, their cholesterol, heart disease is disappearing. Their plaques are dissolving. And then the company was sold for $1 billion to Pfizer, who then did some more studies on it and found it doesn't work. Right? So now no one goes back and says, well, what about these people? If HDL is still protective and these people have got virtually no HDL,
right,
and their form of HDL is not actually protective, what's protecting them? Well, the answer is they're not protected because your hypothesis is wrong.
Or at least it's not the lipids. It cannot be explained by lipids.
No, well, it's got nothing to do with that. Yeah. But I mean, the simple explanation is LDL doesn't cause heart disease and HDL doesn't protect you against heart disease. Because if you remove those from the center, then it makes perfect sense that you'll find a population here with a low rate of heart disease. You just got to find out why. It's not because they're protected against having a low HDL.
Right.
These things don't cause heart disease.
Let me ask you about one thing, and let me know what you think about this idea, because I was thinking about LDL and HDL being kind of like, and I've heard that from other folks too, being kind of like proxies for certain conditions. Like we all know that high triglycerides, low HDL is a beautiful proxy for like metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, and so that clearly can affect heart disease. Or same as LDL, like some metabolic syndrome patients experience an increase in their LDL, and so that might be another proxy. Or we have the whole story around Lp(a), which we can also talk about. And back then, or still, it's often being counted as LDL. And so we cannot always clearly distinguish between Lp(a) and LDL. So that might be a proxy for that. And so we have all these different proxies, which we cover under the guise of lipids, and they increase the risk or they are protective.
Well, I mean, all your points here are correct. But of course, then each one of them becomes like this. I was discussing it the other day with someone else. I said, the problem here is a bit also like you have the Hydra and you chop one head off and then another one appears. And then, so you got two heads. So you thought you had one head, now you got two. So you start talking about dyslipidemia, light fluffy LDL, small dense LDL, HDL. Right. I read a paper that found 36 different versions of HDL.
Sure.
And started discussing them. And I thought, what? You know. Are we supposed to now, as a doctor, be taking 23 versions of LDL and 36 versions of HDL? And what are you doing? This alone should tell you the whole thing is a crock, you know?
This cathedral that's slowly collapsing, you try to support it from all sides.
Exactly. If a hypothesis is correct, so a piece of information comes along and it slots in, click, I can see how that fits. If your hypothesis is wrong, then you're constantly having to adapt it.
Yes.
Constantly having to adapt it. The fact that you're constantly having to adapt it should be proof, all the proof you need that it's wrong. Because a correct hypothesis doesn't get adapted, it's correct. I mean, the cholesterol hypothesis was wrong from the start. Well, you know, the first thing that Ansel Keys, who came up with it, sort of, he said it was cholesterol in your diet that raised your blood cholesterol level. He then gave lots of cholesterol to people and found it made no difference to the cholesterol level in their blood. So instead of going, oh, well, that's obviously wrong, which is what a scientist would do, he goes, well, it's not cholesterol, it's saturated fat. So what made you change your mind? Well, because they're sort of the same sort of a thing. No, they're not. Because lots of foods that have cholesterol in them also have saturated fat. So you immediately had, we call in English a fudge. You can just, and people jump back and forth. You'll find when you talk about it, they go, oh, cholesterol in the food, and oh, saturated fat in the food, and or fat in the food, or a lack of monounsaturated fats, or
polyunsaturated
fats. I mean, how many? You know, I've read papers. It's odd chain polyunsaturated fats, rather than even chain saturated. What am I going to do? I'll have a mass spectrometer on my kitchen table. Before I eat anything, I'll put a sample in it.
And see how many odd chain fatty acids you have in that meal.
The metabolic fatty acid content is, although I don't know, I can tell exactly precisely how healthy it is. I mean, at the start, you know, Ansel Keys had an equation. I can't remember what it is now, but it was your total cholesterol level was a result of your saturated fat minus your polyunsaturated fat divided by cholesterol over 3 divided by 2, whatever. It was a Keys equation.
Yeah.
It could tell you exactly, you eat this, your cholesterol will be that. You eat this, it'll be that. It's complete balls because he already knew the cholesterol had no impact on the cholesterol level in your blood. And yet it was part of his equation from the start.
Funny.
And yet people didn't go, what are you talking about?
Doesn't make sense.
What is this utter rubbish that you are talking about? And he did the experiment. He gave people polyunsaturated fats rather than saturated fats. The total cholesterol fell, which was due to another effect entirely, but we're not going to that. And their rate of cardiovascular disease went up, and their overall mortality went up. So the idea, he disproved all parts of his hypothesis instantaneously in a major experiment.
Exactly.
And then did the truly scientific thing of burying the results. And they were only discovered 40 years later where they were published.
Yeah, I believe we talked about this study the last time we were speaking.
I know, but I mean, it's how this goes.
Yes.
I mean, I've discovered that facts are they have no impact on people. I say to people, there is no epidemiological, there's no consistent or even inconsistent epidemiological evidence that the cholesterol level or the LDL level is associated with your risk of cardiovascular disease. And I can show them papers I've written. I can show them the studies, put them in front of their faces.
So so we discussed epidemiology, we discussed statins, we discussed FH. Another thing that's oftentimes brought up is Mendelian randomization studies. That's kind of oftentimes the most compelling thing that I try to bring up.
So why do people consider this compelling?
I don't know, but they say, okay, so this is most compelling because we look at the people from the very beginning and look at their kind of genetic predisposition. And now we can say, okay, that people with genetically reduced Apo-B have a longer life expectancy, which proves that cholesterol causes heart disease. That's kind of the line of reasoning. What's your comment on Mendelian randomization?
Well, Mendelian randomization requires that the gene that you find is closely associated, or the abnormalities, we call it, associated with that gene has been consistently found to be associated with the disease, which it hasn't. That's what the biobank study was all about: is finding genetic markers or genes associated with cardiovascular disease. They couldn't find any. So how can you do a Mendelian randomization? You can't. I mean, we were told for years that your LDL, for instance, is raised by your diet. Now we found that it isn't. Well, either your LDL is fixed and there's nothing you can do about it.
Oh, yeah.
Which it isn't. Has anyone ever heard of epigenetics? Things might change. So what they're saying is there's no environmental aspect to this at all. Your Apo-B or your Apo-A may be raised or lowered for factors that have nothing whatsoever to do with your genes. They have to do with your environmental factors, how you live your life. If you're stressed, yes, if you're stressed, you will have a higher Apo-B level. That has nothing to do with your genes.
But isn't there kind of a baseline, a predetermined baseline of LDL that's kind of different among individuals, that's determined by their genes? That you're kind of born with different levels?
Well, there will be with FH.
Yeah.
But the average LDL level, the average cholesterol level in, say, Finland has dropped by about 30% in the last 30 years. So it's clearly not fixed by your genes. Otherwise, it couldn't drop by 30%.
I see.
In Japan, between 1950 and the year 2000, the average cholesterol level went from 3.9 to 5.2. All right. So, and then people tell me it's genetically determined what your cholesterol level is. What, the entire population of Japan changed over a 50-year period, and their cholesterol levels went up by 25%. And during that period of time, by the way, their deaths from coronary heart disease went down by 70%. So, if you're going to do you can do Mendelian randomization. And what's the connection between Huntington's chorea and a deficit in a particular gene triggering for Huntington's? That's pretty easy to do. You don't need to do Mendelian randomization, because if you got that gene, you're going to get the disease, and there's nothing you can do about it. But when you can't even find genetic markers for a disease, and we know that epigenetics has a huge part to play in the change and alteration of these factors, Mendelian randomization is meaningless. It is meaningless. I mean, I'm not going to go into, I've read paper after paper about Mendelian randomization. It's made to sound like some quasi super scientific.
Yes.
We've proved it because we've done as if Mendelian randomization. If the assumptions underlying the randomization are wrong, the entire process is just rubbish. If there was one factor for heart disease, or maybe two, you could have a go at this, all right? You can do Mendelian randomization for multiple sclerosis, all right? But when you can't even find a factor, what are you doing with these factors? And these factors are not controlled purely or even at all by their genes. There's also epigenetics. You can change your genetic, methylation of various genes will switch them on and off. And these can actually be carried from generation to generation. But for an individual, we don't know what's happening to the genes. In familial hypercholesterolemia, we have a situation now where you can diagnose familial hypercholesterolemia based on whether they have the genes for familial hypercholesterolemia, whether or not they have a raised LDL.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have familial hypercholesterolemia diagnosed without having a high LDL level. Go figure that one.
Yeah, that's quite.
So these people are programmed to have high LDL and they don't. So what does that prove? It proves that something is doing something that is overriding the function of whatever gene it is that's keying them in for having high LDL. You know, when you've got a when you have a disease for which there are hundreds of potential factors interacting, as we have with heart disease, we know that. Smoking. What's a genetic marker for smoking?
Oh yeah.
What's a genetic marker for not taking any exercise? What's a genetic marker for living in a country that's under a high level of stress? When a Japanese study I quoted they looked at Russia and Japan, and the rate of heart disease in these two countries was different by a factor of 18. All right. And then you take a Japanese person and you move them to another country, they will develop the same rate of heart disease as they had of the surrounding country,
and vice versa.
And no, I don't know necessarily vice versa. There's hardly anyone goes and lives in Japan. They tend to stick to
but I mean that if someone moves,
what you're saying is that the genetic component can only be at maximum 1/18 of what causes heart disease. If you can alter it by a factor of 18 by moving from one country to another.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. That's what you mentioned in your book also, that if you see a person migrating or moving to another country, then generally what happens is that they suddenly develop a similar risk or a similar incidence of heart disease compared to all the other people that were previously living in that country. So it increases or respectively decreases. So it also can happen the other way around.
It can happen the other way around. But I mean, what that's showing you is, since we're all genetically, apparently, equally capable of getting cardiovascular disease, and yet some people have 18, 20, some races and countries have 18, 20 times the rate of another country. The greatest impact that your underlying genetics can have is 1/18.
In terms of heart disease?
Yeah.
Right.
Because the underlying rate would be the rate caused by your genes.
Well, it probably depends on the genetics that we're talking about. Like if your genetic caused some blood clot abnormality, that risk can be much higher than just 1/18.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I'm not saying there's no genetics here. Of course, there's genetics on an individual basis. But when you're trying to explain heart disease differentials, you got to say, what is the total rate that genetics can have? It can only be that.
Yes.
And that's what the UK Biobank studied. They couldn't find any genetic markers. I'm just going to cough.
Sure.
Right. I'm off again.
Yeah, no problem.
I have to call it again a wee bit.
All right.
But I mean, the other concept is, of course, if the genetic marker was working through a causal factor, say through raised LDL, and then you can't find any association between LDL and cardiovascular disease in epidemiological studies.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? It's operating through some unknown mechanism. It's a bit like when people say, oh, there's a family history of heart disease, so you're more likely to get heart disease. Well, it can only be operating through a known factor.
Sure.
Like your blood pressure's higher or whatever.
Lifestyle, like it can be just that lifestyle factor that you're more likely to take over the same lifestyle of your ancestors, and that's why you also have an
Oh yeah, I
inconsistent.
mean the genetics.
But not just the mere presence of, of a family history doesn't tell you anything. It must be a factor that can be quantified, at least.
Yeah, I mean we say Mendelian randomization is just a way of almost silencing argument because no one understands what it is or how it's done or how you would validate it. I mean, first of all, you have to have a very strong marker that is known absolutely to be associated through some known causal mechanism. And then you can't have, it's this. How many markers do you want? Which are the ones that you're going to show? And do you know it's not affected by anything else? This is it. Huntington's chorea, one gene, that's it. Heart disease. I can give you 300 factors. Which one's most important?
Right.
I can find you populations that have, and we know that there's no genetic protection on a population basis against heart disease. Because you can take populations and move them around, and the heart disease rate of these populations alters dramatically. So we know it's not playing a major role in cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is primarily caused by environment and environmental factors. We know that.
And quickly circling back to the HDL thing, because what would be your comment on someone saying, or actually one of the major, I don't want to say consensus, but it's basically what's being also taught in the medical community, that HDL is part of reverse cholesterol transport. That's the mechanism by which it is protective. What does it actually do? What does it actually do?
I mean, I can't argue against the fact that HDL scavenges loose cholesterol around the body, absorbs it, and then transfers it back to LDL and VLDL through a thing called cholesterol ester transfer protein. That process exists.
Yes.
That's fine. But the idea that an HDL molecule can somehow attach itself to an atherosclerotic plaque, can dig out the cholesterol that's within it, absorb that cholesterol, which of course is going to be stuck inside all sorts of other things, then release itself from the plaque and then move into the circulation.
I think we think of it too much as, being equivalent to what we humans would do. Like we could go with our free will. We could enter a room, I don't know, with lots of people. We could go there. We could fight through this this crowd. We could do a particular thing. We could expend energy to do that, and then we could move out of it again. I don't know. But like our physiological inside of our body is kind of based on certain chemical reactions. And what would be the explanation that HDL actually does all these kinds of things, like on a chemical level?
Well, it can't. I mean, because it doesn't possess those capabilities. I mean, a macrophage, which is a white cell, I mean, they are almost living beings. They can go into a plaque and they can eat something effectively. Yes. And then they can move away and take it somewhere else.
Well, but they are also attracted by certain molecules that are being secreted in an inflammatory state.
But an HDL molecule has no capacity to do any of these things.
Exactly.
It floats about, and if it bumps into a cholesterol molecule, it will absorb it. And if it doesn't bump into it, it's not going to seek out cholesterol molecules within a plaque. It can't do that. And even if it did, how would it get them out? And if it did that, fine, it's got the cholesterol within it. But this idea that somehow HDL eats the cholesterol plaque away.
Right.
It's utter nonsense.
Yeah.
It's
that makes sense.
Well, you're saying it's like a hostage situation. HDL molecules line up. Yes, sir. There's cholesterol in that plaque. You've got to go out and get it out. All right. You might.
And it goes in. It has some sort of capacity to move in actively, take something up, and then move out of it again. And it has this capacity to do it, but LDL doesn't have the capacity to do it for some arbitrary reasons. And all the other molecules also don't have the capacity to do this.
I know. It's a unique molecule. Molecules can do, some of them can do some pretty clever things, even though they're inanimate objects. But that is beyond a clever thing.
Exactly.
That requires you to be a a sentient being.
Exactly.
Actually.
Exactly. That was referring to.
They are not those things. There's a lot of these processes make sense if you think about them for 1 second. Oh yes, HDL absorbs cholesterol and then transfers it to LDL. So if we transfer the cholesterol from a plaque into the LDL, then it will gradually disappear. Right.
Great concept.
Well, I'm going to walk to the moon tomorrow. I'm going to build a very, very high ladder.
Yeah.
And keep making it higher and higher, and then I'm going to climb the ladder, and I'll end up at the moon. Yeah,
right.
You don't think maybe that might be a bit difficult? Yeah, well,
maybe.
Not compared to HDL taking cholesterol out of a plaque. I don't.
Right. Right.
It's just nonsense. I mean, we're asked to believe nonsense all the way through.
Another interesting thing, which I find to be also quite nonsensical, and I want to hear your opinion on that, was in a recent lecture that I heard on atherosclerosis in medical school. And if that was true, then that would be one piece to support the actual LDL hypothesis. So I wanted to hear your opinion on that. It basically proposed that hypercholesterolemia, or cholesterol itself, LDL itself, I don't really know. It's kind of, the wordings are all over the place. And so they said that this all by itself can cause endothelial dysfunction. So cholesterol damages the endothelium. I don't know, LDL damages the endothelium. Is there evidence to say that LDL all by itself, or cholesterol all by itself, can damage the endothelium?
No.
Cool. Because I find that to be a bit ridiculous. Because why couldn't we make the same argument for any other damn molecule there is in our bloodstream? Okay. And what's then the mechanism?
So the body produces a molecule in the liver. Well, it doesn't actually. It produces VLDL. There's a specific receptor for it in cells, and this molecule damages the cells. That's your argument. And where's your proof? There isn't any.
Yeah.
So what they realized, and I have seen this movement towards, well, the first thing you've got to do is damage the endothelium, or you've got to damage the lining of the arteries in order for atherosclerosis to start. And of course, LDL doesn't do that. VLDL might actually more likely do that. There is actually evidence that HDL is anticoagulant, stops blood clotting. It has an anticoagulant action. And there is some evidence, it's quite strong evidence, that VLDL is procoagulant. And there is some evidence that LDL might be procoagulant in some activities. Now that's different than damaging the endothelium.
Right. But that argument directly referred to the apparent, alleged idea that that LDL by itself, kind of like, I don't know, as we think of smoke particles, I don't know what else we think of damaging to the endothelium or to the glycocalyx, glucose for that matter, I don't know, that LDL all by itself is also capable of producing the same damage.
No, well, I've never, through what mechanism?
That was my question too.
We can understand that, we can see the mechanism by which glucose does it.
What's the mechanism? I'm curious.
Sorry?
What's the mechanism by which glucose damages the glycocalyx?
Well, at a purely molecular level, I'm not entirely sure.
Sure,
we know the strands are made of glucose and protein, and if you increase the sugar protein, it seems to break the bonds between the protein and the sugar, and therefore strips down the glycocalyx side.
That's interesting. Okay. Just wasn't quite aware of that mechanism.
No, well, I don't think anyone is quite aware of the mechanism, but I've seen that one proposed.
Okay.
But we know that it does it because we can see that it does it. And there is a hypothetical belief that, yes, you would damage the glycocalyx with a high glucose level because it changes the concentration of glucose to protein and starts stripping the glucose bit out of the glycoprotein, which is what the glycocalyx is.
Yes.
How does a nanoparticle damage an endothelial cell? Well, I'm not entirely sure. I'm just assuming it's quite toxic in many different ways, because it's not supposed to be there, and it gets into the glycocalyx, and it's like, I don't know the exact mechanism. I don't think anyone does. We know that exotoxins produced by bacteria in sepsis, they leak out in the exotoxins, leak out the bacteria, and then attack the glycocalyx and endothelium such that they damage it quite severely. I mean, you can see quite clearly how, say, SARS-CoV-2 causes endothelial damage. that it enters the cells and then destroys them or disrupts them. So we can see how that would do it. The actual substance is, how does lead damage the glycocalyx and the endothelium? It's a toxic substance, isn't it?
It damages the cell.
Damages the cell, and therefore, if you damage the cell, the glycocalyx tends to be reduced in size.
Right, exactly.
Because the cell can't make it anymore. So maybe it's just that's the pure process, rather than the actual glycocalyx is snapped off and broken. But you can actually measure glycocalyx particles, the hyaluron and chondroitin floating around in the bloodstream. So they do get individually damaged to the glycocalyx if you have a high blood sugar level.
Yes.
So you see the bits of glycocalyx floating around. You can measure it. In fact, I was speaking to an American group who are looking at 5 measures of glycocalyx damage, measuring 5 factors that you can find in the bloodstream that are most closely associated with an increased risk of heart disease. So quite exactly what the exact biochemical, mechanical mechanism is, I don't know.
Sure.
To be frank, but I'm assuming it is that in some way.
But at least we are aware of that evidence that we can observe the damage to the glycocalyx after, I don't know, after glucose, an increase of glucose.
You can also measure the glycocalyx thickness.
Or that you can measure directly the glycocalyx thickness. So we have ways to measure the damage that occurs after a postprandial glucose increase, for example.
Yeah.
And now the question I was asking: do we have not any evidence, not any mechanistic evidence how LDL could damage the endothelium, but some sort of observational evidence that we see the damage that happens to the endothelium or to the glycocalyx when LDL is increased? And you say there is no evidence.
I've never seen any.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, because I was quite surprised by that claim.
Well, this is just anonymous, like female sex hormones protecting.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, well, we know that LDL causes heart disease. Yes, if you start thinking about it, there's no way LDL can penetrate the endothelium. So the endothelium has to be damaged first. And as we know that LDL causes heart disease, it must damage the endothelium, because otherwise it can't cause heart disease. It's just that same argument.
Right.
We know it must because it does,
Exactly.
And because it does, it must do this, because that's the thing that actually is the thing that causes. Just stop.
Yeah. So we have actually made a segue into what you explain in your book. Kind of the most important steps that have to happen in order for an atherosclerotic plaque to develop, ultimately heart disease, etc. And so we mentioned endothelial damage or endothelial dysfunction or glycocalyx dysfunction. Again, 10,000 terms that you could use for the same thing.
Yeah.
We mentioned a couple of things that could do that. And would you say that this is kind of the most important step in that whole line of events?
Well, I think if it doesn't happen, you can't get atherosclerotic plaques developing. So, yes, it's like removing the safety catch from a gun. Until you do, it doesn't fire. So you've got to do this first. And we know that because all the factors that are in the arteries are also in the veins.
Right.
And you never get atherosclerotic plaques in the veins. Ever.
I've never heard anyone that kind of that believes in the mainstream LDL hypothesis, kind of countering that argument. So have you heard of any criticisms?
Did you say it's multifactorial? No, it's just nonsense, isn't it? Well, I mean, put simplistically, your veins, the blood pressure in your veins is about 6 millimeters of mercury over 0.
Exactly.
And the
so
blood
no pressure, virtually.
The blood is traveling slowly. Whereas in your arteries, the blood pressure is 120, 140 millimeters of mercury. And where it has to change direction to go from one artery to another or into your coronary arteries, there's a great deal of biomechanical stress at these points. So your endothelium is battling hard just to cling on. Whereas in your veins, it's under no pressure at all.
Right.
So simplistically, we know this is the case because if you get conditions where you get high blood pressure in the lungs, specifically Eisenmenger's syndrome, which is where you get a septal defect between the left and the right side of the heart. And so the blood pressure in the lungs, instead of being 20 over 0, is is now 120 over whatever. You get plaques in the lungs.
Interesting. Yeah.
Or if you have an artery that comes out the wrong side of your heart and goes into a bit of your lung, you can get atherosclerosis in that part of the lung or that particular artery, which normally doesn't.
Right.
So we know that blood pressure is essential above a certain level, whatever that level is. We know that blood pressure above a certain level is essential, or is a necessary factor for atherosclerosis.
So we can have this without damage occurring first.
Yes. Well,
and that all kinds of different factors and things that could damage the endothelium.
First of all, you need the endothelium to be in a high stress blood pressure environment.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Fair enough.
And after that, of course, you start adding things on and saying, well, so what else can damage the endothelium? You know, the place where you get most atherosclerosis, although it doesn't call atherosclerosis, is in the valves of the aorta in your heart. Because
I need to tell you a quick story. I had a it wasn't a lecture. It was just a kind of a seminar. Okay, so we had a good teacher, very nice guy, and we were talking about aortic valve stenosis and all this kind of diseases that have to do with valves in our hearts. And that was so funny. I remember, I still remember that because I didn't get over that because the immediate thing so the line of explanation was basically, we have aortic valve stenosis. This leads to certain consequences, and that's the way we treat aortic valve stenosis. And I mean, like, okay, so what causes aortic valve stenosis? Because not every person on this planet develops aortic valve stenosis. And I asked him this question, like, what's the actual cause? And he'd be like, yeah, man, that's a good question. I'm like, you're a damn doctor. Like, you have never asked this question yourself? I'm like the very first one talking to you who have ever asked this question. What causes aortic valve stenosis? He couldn't provide me with an answer. So I'm curious to learn.
Well, because he doesn't know. He's never thought about it.
Yeah. Okay, go on. Okay, what happens in aortic valve stenosis?
Well, aortic valve stenosis is basically atherosclerosis, but it's in such a small area that it can't develop plaques. But you get many signs are across. You can see an atherosclerosis when you get damage to the aortic valves. We call. I mean, there are other causes, but primarily what you're getting is atherosclerosis of the valve. And then it becomes calcified, as it does with atherosclerosis. And once its calcification becomes greater and greater, then the valve becomes stiff. And then you get effectively, it doesn't allow the blood to go through it, at which point you end up with all the heart failures and blah, blah, blah. But it is atherosclerosis of the aortic valve. And you say, well, how does it ever manage to survive that level of battering? I mean, it's an amazing valve that does that, but it does. And so the things that tend to increase the aortic valve stenosis are the same things that increase the risk of atherosclerosis.
Right.
We're looking at the same pattern. It's not exactly the same. I mean, some people have bicuspid valves and things like that, which mean that they're under greater stress and don't operate as well. But yes, this is you're looking at it and saying, well, by the age of, I think, if I remember correctly, by the age of 40, everybody has some sign of stenotic valve in their aortic valve. One of the leaves or other. By the age of 60, everybody has, and so it's just a thing that happens, all right. And there you say, well, do I know that blood pressure and biomechanical stress causes atherosclerosis? Well, let's look at the place under the greatest biomechanical stress that we can imagine, and yes, that's where it is.
Right.
So, and so, if you like, I like to look at things that way and say, well, let's say, where's the least biomechanical stress? It's in your valve. It's in your veins, isn't it?
It's in your veins.
And you never get atherosclerosis in your veins. So clearly, there's a biomechanical stress, pressure, whatever you want to call it, thing. Why do you get so many plaques in your heart? Well, in the coronary arteries? Well, because they're probably under the greatest stress that there is. Your heart's doing this every second, such that when the heart is contracting, the blood doesn't flow because the pressure clamps the artery shut. The blood only flows during diastole.
Inside the coronary arteries, exactly.
So somebody said it's like stomping on a garden hose 60 times a minute. Bang, bang, bang. Well, surprise, surprise, there's going to be damage occurring, quite likely to be there.
Okay.
And also the carotid arteries in your neck. This is blood pressure comes straight out of your heart up into your neck, into these arteries that are quite wibbly wobbly, and they're wibbling and under pressure, and it's happening all the time. So surprise, surprise, this is about the second most common place to get it. So if you look at the art of the body and say, where would you think it would develop if it was due to turbulent flow or biomechanical stress or whatever term you want to use? Well, it would happen in the coronary arteries, the aortic valve, and the carotid artery, and that's where you see it develop.
So move us through the process that you describe in your book. Maybe I believe we will need another session to go into much more detail when it comes to the actual processes, but just in general to give us an idea.
Putting it very simply is that you damage the endothelium, the glycocalyx, the endothelium itself, whatever it's called, sufficiently that it becomes, instead of becoming an anticoagulant, which is a very potent anticoagulant, it becomes procoagulant. It says, I've got damage here, I need a blood clot to come along and cover it over. Because obviously, if you get damage to a blood vessel, that's something the body doesn't like, especially if it's in an artery. It wants to cover that over.
Sure.
There's a whole fascinating world, if you want to look at it, of the different clotting factors in the endothelium of veins and arteries.
But generally, you could say if the blood gets in contact, with the collagen fibers, then you have this clotting cascade being initiated.
Yeah. Well, basically, it says, "Oh my goodness, I've got damage to an artery." Clot. Because it must do that, and it happens very quickly. And the clot that forms, obviously, it can't keep growing forever and ever. Or every time you had a clot, you'd block your artery and you'd be dead. So
and it can just fall off. It can just fall off.
They can just fall off. We've seen this. If it happens in the neck, it's the commonest cause of a stroke. It falls off and it goes up in the brain.
But we see it produces horrible damage if it just falls off.
Oh yeah, well it can't fall off, because it does fall off, but
it does sometimes, and it's very tragic.
A clot that forms in your heart, in a top part of an artery that falls off, will just go into a narrow bit of your artery further down and block it completely.
Right.
And then you're really in trouble.
Exactly.
So that clot has to be dealt with.
Exactly.
So as you say to people, if you scratch your skin, you get a clot. We call it a scab, and then the skin grows underneath and it falls off. Well, that's not a problem because it falls to the ground.
Right. That was the point I was trying to make.
In your heart, your arteries, it would be a disaster. So it doesn't. Well, we know it's a disaster because you get a blood clot that occurs in your leg, and it goes through your heart and into your lungs. So blood clots,
not a good thing.
Need to be controlled.
Exactly.
So the blood clot forms. It's shaved down till it's thinner, and at that point, new endothelium or new endothelial cells find this area, stick to it. They're called endothelial progenitor cells. They grow over the top of it. And now the blood clot is inside the artery wall, within the artery wall. And then along come the repair processes, like the macrophages. They attack it, break it down, and get rid of it. So this is happening. I hate to say it to people. This is happening all the time.
Right. Quick question. Quick question. Why does not fibrinolysis manage to remove the blood clot completely? Why does it have to be covered by a new layer of endothelial progenitor cells?
Well, obviously, you have to have a new endothelial layer. There are no cells...
because it was damaged, sure.
There's whether there are endothelial cells or not underneath the clot is not really relevant. It could just stick to damaged rather than missing endothelial cells. But the body can't allow it to break off and travel down the system. Obviously, you've got what they call a mural thrombosis, a thrombus stuck to the side of the artery wall. Either it's if it just broke off again, or it was dissolved completely, you then have an area of damage underneath that would then just be covered by another clot. So you just have a repeating process going on forever and ever, which would be completely pointless.
Sure.
The other thing to remember is the endothelial cells do not grow up like the skin. We've got pre-skin cells that grow up through the layers.
From the bottom, exactly.
From the bottom, and they're growing continuously. That's why you're shedding.
From the basal layer.
From the basal layer. But in your artery, you don't have that. There's only one cell, thick. There's nothing to produce the new cell from underneath.
Yeah.
So So there is no cell that can come up from underneath. And if it did, it would knock the clot off anyway. So the cell can't grow from underneath.
Makes sense.
So this fooled a lot of people for a long time. So where does the new endothelial cell come from? It comes from within the blood, and of course it comes from within the blood. It was made in the bone marrow. It's floating around in your bloodstream all the time. They're called endothelial progenitor cells. If they see a damaged area covered in clot, their job is to stick to that and form a new layer. That's how you get rid of clots that form on artery walls. That's what happens. It has to. There's no other process available. So of course, then you have this thrombus inside the artery wall, and you say, well, most of it will be got rid of. But if it's not got rid of fully, or another one, that's going to become a vulnerable area. It's not quite healthy, and it was already a place where a clot might form anyway. So it's a clot then formed. It's not entirely healthy. The underlying blood vessel wall is got a bit of clot stuck in it, so it probably becomes maybe slightly lumpy. So it becomes a turbulent area. So for whatever reasons, many reasons, that becomes the area where the next blood clot is likely to happen.
Right, and that's the reason why you don't have a continuous streak that's distributed over your entire blood vessel system, but only in specific spots.
It's only in specific spots, which again is, if the LDL hypothesis is correct, LDL would be leaking through all arteries everywhere. And you'd have atherosclerosis evenly distributed throughout all your arteries everywhere.
But it's literally the fact that we observe certain huge accumulations of plaque in just tiny spots, and then the rest is completely clean. Nothing. So zero.
You have to explain that. Well, it's almost like chaos theory, the flapping of a butterfly's wing. It can just be bad luck. This little spot one day, there's a bit of turbulent flow, a clot formed, there was repair. But now it's the place most likely to have the next clot, the next plaque growth. That's where it's going to happen. And as it gets bigger and bigger, obviously it becomes more and more. So you can get, artery narrows and narrows, and obviously this becomes a particularly key spot. So it's not difficult to explain, as long as you forget everything about LDL and blah, blah, blah. So it's this point. So you need to make sure you're not damaging that. Whatever you're doing, don't damage the endothelium and the glycocalyx beyond the normal damage that is going to be happening to it.
And subsequently also the normal repair process that would occur. So that would not be a problem, net zero.
Yes. Net zero. If your repair systems are working well, new endothelium grows, a bit of clots inside your artery, and then repair systems and macrophages and everything else come and dissolve it away, and it's gone. Never you knew it was there. It's perfect magic. It's like getting a scrape on your car door, and these people come along and they scrape it off and they duff it down, and they spray it again and they duff it down, and you think, oh, that's fantastic. I can't even see where it worked. All right.
Right.
But if you look really hard, you probably find there was a bit of evidence that it was there. Probably.
Maybe there's like a tiny scar left, but no narrowing, nothing that would indicate like pathophysiological state.
No, you wouldn't. But I mean, the work done in the 80s by a researcher who I spoke to, she looked at, what would you expect to find in an artery wall that looked normal, but had previously had a blood clot inside it? You would expect to find the most difficult protein to break down that there is, and that's fibrin.
Oh, inside of an artery wall.
So fibrin is the kind of bones, if you like. The rest of the body is gone, but you've still got a bit of fibrin because it's difficult stuff to break down fully. It's designed not to break, and it's designed to be very robust because it binds around a clot and it holds it together. And when in order to get rid of clots, you chop fibrin into bits and it's gone. But a few bits are left, or strands. So what she found was that you could find fibrinogen remnants in healthy artery walls. And how does it get there? Well, the only way you're going to get there was the part of a blood clot. So even though the artery might look healthy, might look fine, you can look around, you can find this fibrin there.
Wow.
So, it's clear that in this case, she said healthy artery walls that look fine, but actually you look really closely, there we go. There's fibrin in there. It happened, it got in, and it's still, bits of it are still left. Not enough bits that, I've got a scar on my wrist. I tried to break into my own house years ago. broke my wrist on the window, and just cut my wrist on the window. And as you can see, I've got a scar here from
Right.
like 50 years ago, and it's
But your
white.
skin is healthy again. It's just that scar that is left.
Yeah. Well, I forgot about that. You can't see if I do that, but you can see there's still signs that it was there.
Sure.
There's calcification, which happens after many years of damage. It turned to calcified. So this is happening to us all the time.
Yes.
But what the factors that increase that damage, the factors that cause that damage to accelerate, or the factors that make the blood clot that forms either bigger or more difficult to remove, or
increase the damage.
Yeah. So you've got a kind of, I like to think of it as a triad. You've got endothelial glycocalyx damage.
Number one.
And you've got blood clot thrombus formation or abnormal blood clot formation, or dysfunctional blood clot formation, or whatever term you want. And then you've got dysfunctional repair systems.
Right.
So it's like a Venn diagram. So you've got a circle and a circle and a circle. And right in the middle of that, if you got all three, then you're in significant trouble. Right?
Then you're in trouble.
That's the big one.
Okay, so then the next question would be: we know that's obviously a clear observation that we made, is that a certain fraction of that plaque is cholesterol.
Some of it is, yeah.
And now the question is, where does it come from? We see fibrin. Where does it come from? Probably from blood clots. Okay, so now we see LDL, we see cholesterol, we see whatever. And now the immediate conclusion that we jump to is, well, it must be from LDL-containing lipoproteins. Why not others? But okay, it must be from LDL-containing lipoproteins because that's the molecules that carry cholesterol. And now you say it comes from red blood cells.
You can also see some side of the Apo-B molecule, which is the apolipoprotein that's attached to the outside of LDL molecules, can be found there as well. If you stain for it, you can find that. Yeah. And then obviously then there's this connection. Well, it's got cholesterol in it. Where can the cholesterol come from? It must have come from the blood. Where else could it come from?
Well,
it could have come from, as I describe in the book, the first observations where we find cholesterol crystals in plaques, which are like sharp javelin-shaped things, if you like. Cholesterol crystals cannot be made from the cholesterol that you find in LDL. It's just not biochemically possible.
Is it esters?
Well, what's carried in your LDL molecule, the cholesterol that's carried in your LDL molecule, is attached to a fatty acid.
And that's in cholesterol
if you
ester.
Attach a cholesterol molecule to a fatty acid, you have what's called a cholesterol ester. That's how it's carried around in the blood. That's how it's absorbed from your bowel. That's why you need bile acids to be released. Bile salts to be released from your gallbladder to link to fat.
And these cannot form these crystals?
No.
Okay.
They can't. These are pure cholesterol crystals, so they can't be made from cholesterol esters.
Okay.
Right? That's just a fact, right? So that's a chemical fact. There's not many facts in medicine, but that's one. So you're going to say, well, where else can this cholesterol have come from? Well, the only place that has a high concentration of free cholesterol, a high enough concentration of free cholesterol, is in the membrane of red blood cells. The red blood cells contain free cholesterol. And in fact, there is evidence, and there's studies, you can look it up yourself, where people have said, well, the free cholesterol that we find, the cholesterol crystals that we find within plaques cannot have come from LDL. Cannot have come from LDL. It's not like improbable. It's not like, I can see a 536 stage process, which ends up with a cholesterol crystal, which just can't have come from there. So the cholesterol that we see comes from red blood cells. There are cholesterol esters in there, and there are the remnants of lipoproteins in there. The cholesterol crystals and the free cholesterol that we see cannot have come from LDL. It's impossible for it to have done so. But we now know it does come from red blood cells. So what are the lipoprotein remnants that we're seeing? Well, we will be seeing lipoprotein remnants that are things like VLDL and LDL, because lipid surfaces are where fibrinogen is linked to form fibrin. That's where it happens. I don't know why it's where it happens, but it's where it happens. And VLDL itself is procoagulant. If you drop VLDL into blood, it clots. Anyway, and that's probably due to the impact it has on stimulating fibrin to be linked together to form fibrinogen being linked together to form fibrin. So the lipids have pro and anticoagulant effects. They're also the places where fibrin is linked together. So some LDL and VLDL are going to be dragged into all clots as they form. But of course, more importantly, there is another form of LDL called lipoprotein A,
right,
which most people have never heard of. but it's incredibly important. LPA, lipoprotein A, is LDL, and it has an additional protein attached to it called apolipoprotein A, shortened to Apo-A. And
Very creative name, by the way. Little A, cool name.
Little A. Most doctors don't realize that LDL and LPA are the same thing.
Right.
Primarily the main structure.
And so now it has this tail attached with this, which is
whatever it looks like exactly. It's got a scarf around its neck. The scarf around his neck is this additional protein, and this protein has a critical role in the repair of damaged blood vessels. Because Apo-A and lipoprotein A is attracted to areas of arterial damage or any blood vessel damage. It sticks to them. It binds to the underlying collagen using a protein which I can't remember the name of at the moment. It's just gone from my brain, and it forms a very tight bind to the underlying wall. So it's probably the first part of the plaque that actually happens even before platelets start sticking together. LPA is in there blocking everything off, and then platelets come and form a platelet plug, and then fibrin comes, and then everything is dragged in at that point. And the reason why it has this role is, I believe, in it, it's been recognized by a few people, but others just don't even mention it, is that, and this takes it to a different, it's so fascinating how it links again. Humans can't make our own vitamin C. And there's about 20 animal species that can't do this, including guinea pigs, great apes and stuff. Basically animals that have a shitload of vitamin C that they could eat most of the time, so they gave up bothering making it, I suppose.
Probably.
Yeah, happened 40 million years ago or something. Who knows how they worked that out? I don't know, but it did. And if you don't have vitamin C, you can't make collagen. If you can't make collagen, your blood vessels start to break and crack, along with all sorts of other things.
That's scurvy.
To collagen being like the steel bars through concrete or whatever, however you want to think of it. So no steel bars, the concrete becomes cracky. Your blood vessels start to crack, which is why when you have scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C, one of the first signs is bleeding gums. Because the small blood vessels here start to break and the blood starts to escape. Well, it's not just happening in small blood vessels; it's happening in all your blood vessels. And the reason why you die with scurvy is because you bleed to death, slowly, horribly, and there's all sorts of other nasty things happen. But anyway, so as a kind of repair mechanism, we believe, because the animals that have LPA are animals that don't make vitamin C. As a repair mechanism, this lipoprotein A says, oh, there's a crack in the blood vessel. I will plug it. And that will be very difficult to remove, because I don't want to be removed, because I'm trying to stop the bleeding to death thing from happening. So it sticks very firmly, and it has two main processes that make it really stick well. One is it stops the production of a thing called tissue factor. No, it stops the production of a thing that get this right. There's a thing in your blood vessels called tissue factor.
That induces actually the blood clot cascade.
Inducer of blood clotting, right? And it sits inside your endothelial cells and all. And so if things are exposed, the tissue factor is exposed, and bang, blood clot will form.
Right.
It overrides all the other mechanisms. It just gets straight to the point. Blood clot. Now, there's a thing that also is produced at the same time called tissue factor inhibitor.
Right.
Tissue plaque. TPFI. What does P stand for? Anyway, so tissue factor inhibitor is produced all the time. Now, if the endothelial cells are damaged, this inhibitor factor is gone, so the tissue factor is now allowed to operate. But LPA also has this function of blocking the actions of the tissue factor inhibitor.
Okay.
So it makes blood clots form more rapidly, which you can understand is trying to protect the area. But more importantly, it also, when a blood clot forms, it has to be broken down and shaved down, otherwise you can never get rid of it. I was saying earlier that fibrin is really hard to get rid of. The thing that gets rid of it is every clot that forms incorporates a protein called plasminogen. And the plasminogen sits inside the clot doing nothing until another enzyme comes along called tissue plasminogen activator. The thing that activates plasminogen chops a bit off the end, I presume, or does something to it. And then plasminogen is turned into a thing called plasmin. Plasmin is the thing that slices fibrin apart.
So that's fibrinolysis. That's a process
That's
of removing the
fibrinolysis.
clot.
That shaves the clot. That's the stuff you're given if you have a heart attack. Some people are given TPA to turn the plasminogen into plasmin. It breaks the clot apart, and the clot's gone.
And just for people to understand the physiological importance of this fibrinolysis thing, because you need, even if you want a clot to develop, then you still want this to happen in a balanced way, because you also need fibrinolysis going on simultaneously to the blood clotting cascade, so that the clot does not grow too large.
Yes.
So that's why it's important to happen.
Once you, of course, if you said we can't allow a blood clot to just break off and travel down the body,
and it can just grow endlessly. It can just grow endlessly. So that's why I need this fibrinolysis.
Yeah, we have to have some way of getting rid of it. There are other factors that prevent the growth of the plaque rather than plasmin. But once you've got a plaque that's developed, it has to be able to be chopped down and removed.
Exactly.
You can never get rid of it. It's like trying to break down your phone. I mean, it's really tough stuff. It would take years. It would be lying there for forever. So this conversion of plasminogen to plasmin, slice the clot apart, is essential. Otherwise, you'd just be a big blood clot and you'd be dead. Right? We would, you got blood clots under your skin. Obviously,
all right.
Bruise. Yeah. That bruise has to be broken down and the blood remnants have to be removed. Otherwise, the bruise would never go. So anyway, that happens. So TPA turns plasminogen into plasmin that slices the clot apart and allows it to be got rid of. Okay. However, apolipoprotein A, which is this shape, all right, and plasminogen is this shape. And you say, well, they're the same shape, all right? I go, yes, they are. But one of them, you ever tried shaking hands with your right hand and your left hand? That's called stereoisomer shape.
Right.
If you fold a protein, now you might have heard of protein folding. You fold a protein differently, stop it working. So if it was folded like that, it might be my thumb and my finger are exactly the same, but I just happen to have turned my thumb in. Right now it doesn't work as the same way. So if you turn plasminogen looks like this, and apolipoprotein A looks like this. It's the same thing except it's folded differently. Because it's folded differently, along comes TPA, and it goes, I can't do anything with that.
Right.
All right. I can't do it. Or if it was this shape instead of this shape, TPA comes along like that. Or TPA comes along like that. It can't activate it. So it inhibits plasminogen being turned into plasmin, blocks the effects of TPA, stops the clot from being broken down.
Because it mimics plasminogen, because lipoprotein little a mimics plasminogen in some sense, it now binds, it now inhibits the function of tissue plasminogen activator.
Exactly how it inhibits it. I mean, you have all these areas of active sites of enzymes. I presume what it does, it half gets into the active site, and then doesn't actually manage to do anything. So
well, even if it binds to apolipoprotein little a, this is not plasminogen, so it gets not converted to plasmin.
Yeah, but it might do the thing of binding, because what most enzymes do is they do this really fast.
Right.
But it comes up against plasminogen, apolipoprotein A, and it goes, and it hasn't done the conversion, so it's stuck. That's how you inhibit by a lot of enzymes. You just you do that.
And now you have less. As a result, you have less fibrinolysis going on because,
however it works, if you have a clot with apolipoprotein A and LPA in it, it's much more difficult. It won't block it entirely, but it'll be much more difficult to be broken down. So this is a particularly resilient clot. And it's sitting there. So surprise, surprise, if you have a particularly resilient clot, it's more difficult for the repair mechanisms to get rid of it. And therefore, it is more likely to still be stuck there when the next clot arrives. And therefore, what you have is a situation where the clot is partially converted, becomes plaque, but it becomes a focus. And the more LPA you have in your blood, the more likely it is that each blood clot forms on your artery wall. It's going to be more difficult to get rid of. So you're going to get accelerated plaque development and growth.
Right.
What you're also going to find is more of the lipoproteins stuck inside the plaque. And that is what you find, and the work was done, and this is going back years and years and years. Because most people have found what they said is LDL within a plaque, and said, oh, that's LDL, so it must have come from the bloodstream. He said, yes, but how do you know it's LDL? How do you know it's not LPA? Well, it's LDL, isn't it?
It has Apo-B.
It looks exactly the same, except it has this scarf. Have you looked for the scarf? No. Well, look for the scarf. And when you look for the scarf,
You
there
find
it is.
right.
What they call co-localized. In other words, it's in the same place. How can it be co-localized? Because it arrived attached to the same lipoprotein. That's how it happens. So we're looking at the wrong. Yeah, so we say lipids don't cause heart disease or lipoproteins don't cause heart disease. Well, apart from
LP little a.
LDL with a scarf on it. So it is LDL that causes heart disease. Except, of course, it's not LDL that causes heart disease.
Right.
So the things look very similar. Look at them closely, and you'll see they're not looking at the same thing. If you looked at plasminogen and apolipoprotein A, quickly you'd say these are the same thing. Say, no, they're not.
Except they're not.
They are, small differences. Whether something's right-handed or left-handed can make all the difference in the world to how the body reacts to it. You can get all sugars, almost everything in nature is left-handed, should we say, L. Okay. Because then all our enzymes and everything are used to dealing with it. Okay, they all come in and fit this way. Hardly anything is R.
Right.
Because then all enzymes would come in and they wouldn't be able to do anything. So we deal with. So if you have glucose, if you have R glucose, the body tastes it as sugar, but it can't absorb it, and it can't metabolize it.
So there's very small differences in the chemical structure, even not the structure of the atoms, but that's how they are positioned. Even that can make a huge difference in our physiology.
Well, the positioning of atoms and the positioning of bonds is absolutely critical to everything. Protein folding is hugely complicated. No one really understands how it happens. But you fold your protein slightly differently, and instead of being, as I say, like plasminogen is plasminogen, apolipoprotein A is anti-plasminogen. It looks the same. It's like matter and antimatter. Don't get them together, because anyway, to all intents and purposes, you have two things that are the same thing. But one of them is this shape, and the other one is this shape, and that is all there. With thalidomide, which you've heard of, the R version was the one that caused all the problems. The L version causes no problems.
Right.
And this is true of many different things. So, and you'll find that some drugs, you've heard of some drugs are called where they take normally when chemicals are produced, you get 50% R and 50% L, just because the big vat just creates 50% of one and 50%. They're not quite. And so it's quite difficult to get just one version of it. But some drugs are now, they pull out the R version, they get rid of the right version or the left version, and only give you one version. So the racemic make. Anyway, so what we have here is a situation whereby we do have a lipoprotein intimately involved in blood clot formation and the creation of atherosclerotic plaque, or the accelerated formation of atherosclerotic plaque. It does not damage the endothelium. It does not damage the lipocalyx, but once the clot forms,
I think we need to point out that there is still a reason to appreciate LP because it evolved as a result of an increased evolutionary pressure to stop us from prevent us from bleeding to death. Probably that might be an explanation. Yeah. I mean, we need to find an explanation why we have it. I believe looking at LP and saying we presume it has no function until we find one is the wrong way to look at it. I mean, the baseline assumption has to be it has a function because it exists in our body. Yeah, that alone is proof of function.
Exactly. I mean, the body, people say, oh, look at the appendix. Well, apparently the appendix does have a function.
Oh, it has to. Otherwise, not every single human being would have an appendix.
When they said about DNA when they first finished it, they said, oh, look, 90% of it is just junk. Right. Now we know. Now we know we have CRISPR. That is not junk. Everything has a purpose in there. You just didn't know what the purpose was. Right? The body's not going to keep. Making vitamin C is quite a good thing. Yet we don't.
And there has to be an explanation for that.
Must have been beneficial to stop doing it.
Right. It has to. And
And in
if
fact,
we,
you can see that humans have a particular way of shuttling glucose and vitamin C.
yeah,
That we need a lot less vitamin C. So we first of all needed a lot less vitamin C, and then we got rid of needing to have vitamin C. And now that caused its secondary problem of the bleeding to death thing. So those animals that produced the staple lipoprotein A were more likely to survive in times when you couldn't get enough vitamin C. So presumably there was only a very few individuals that had this, but they were more likely to survive times of vitamin C lack, and then they bred, and now everyone's got LPA.
Right.
And some people have more and some people have less.
Right.
Yes, I mean, this is just evolution in action. And if we all let enough vitamin C, we'd never need it, and presumably LPA would go, and you never hear of it again.
And just the increased risk, going back to talking about LP(a), the increased risk that is associated with an increased level of LP(a), it's not a result of the malevolent nature of LP(a). It's like it's the result of the completely different environment that we find ourselves in. Because probably back then, looking at all the physiological functions of LP(a), it seems to have very beneficial roles.
Yes.
Yet looking at the environment that we are today in, it's the risk of bleeding of any sort is reduced almost to zero. There's almost no stuff going on where we cut ourselves all the time. There's no like things that increase our risk of bleeding to death. So there is over the last couple of decades even, the risk of bleeding has went down dramatically, and that's suddenly where LP(a) has become a problem.
Yes. Well, I think that's a good explanation. Absolutely. I mean, you can argue these things. You can give an explanation for them. But you say, LPA. Some people have more LPA than they have LDL. In general, it's about a quarter of the level, but that's still quite a lot. There's a lot of it being made. There's a lot of it out there. So it's not just being made for no reason.
Absolutely. It's being made. Like there's a gene coding for the actual protein.
Of course there is. Yeah.
It's quite something.
A big effort as well. Making a protein like that's a big metabolic effort.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, vitamin C is almost the same as sugar.
And if people say, yeah, it's an evolutionary mistake that we made Apo(a), are you so sure about that? Like, it's a big effort to produce a protein, to code for a protein, and the whole machinery behind it.
Evolution can't make a mistake.
Right.
But the purpose behind which it happened might have gone.
That's right.
It can't be a mistake.
But it was an advantage.
It wouldn't be there otherwise.
Exactly.
That's how evolution is.
And now the most funny thing is when people talk about entire organs, like the appendix is useless. It's like, okay, it's not just one protein. It's like a bunch of different proteins connected into a cell. These cells connected by junctions and whatnot, desmosomes, lined up in a way that inhibits certain other functions so that it produces an organ, an actual organ. And so that entire system, that effort to produce that organ is useless, is a damn mistake.
Yes.
So
it just
silly.
Happened by accident. We just got appendix by accident.
Yes.
I mean, and now we realize it recharges the colon if there's been an infection, and it harbors beneficial bacteria. And so if you get yourself a nasty stomach infection, it clears all your good bacteria out. The appendix is a reservoir for recharging with healthy bacteria. So there you are. It has a purpose. It's not a vestibular.
Absolutely.
And all this DNA genetics that you said, well, it doesn't appear to have a function, so it's junk DNA.
Beautiful explanation.
Anyway, however, so I think so. Essentially, getting back to our thing, yes, LPA, that's a thing. That's a risk factor for heart disease.
Sure,
triples the risk of cardiovascular disease. So. And how does it do it? Well, we explain how it does. It's not simple to explain.
It's not it's not because it's evil and we need to get rid of it.
No.
That's the wrong way of looking at it.
Yes.
I believe.
It's just it's like a lot of things. You have to, if you don't do anything else that damages your arteries, LPA will stay doing nothing. It should damage your arteries.
Exactly.
Of course, and it would probably, in small amounts, it's probably a good thing. You're really forming a good plug. You're really repairing it. You're really making sure no further blood loss can occur. Like a lot of things, too much of it, too much damage, and LPA can become your enemy rather than your friend. You just flipped it over in one way. So it's a thing, And I would say to people, LPA doesn't cause heart disease. It increases the risk of heart disease.
Exactly.
But if
Like
you can,
cause is not accurate enough, I believe, in this context.
our words are not accurate, are
Yeah,
they?
we need to understand the context in its entirety, and with the nuances and the actual processes.
Oh,
So that
absolutely. It's
I
like
believe.
saying this is bad.
Yes, it's stupid.
It's like saying exercise is bad for you because some people who exercise, get more atherosclerosis and that. Okay, so we'll all stop exercising then.
Oh yeah, that's all kinds of stupid ways to.
Having an LDL level of 50 is bad for you, so we mustn't allow the LDL to be.
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I find the thinking involved is like, what? Just,
Yeah, just
anyway.
oftentimes doesn't make much sense. So
Yeah.
we
So
could go much deeper into the into so much more detail when it comes to the actual processes. I believe we're 2 hours and 40 minutes in. It's quite something.
Yeah.
I believe we need to schedule another session to talk about the mechanisms in more detail, and then I believe we need also some time to discuss what you now can do to alleviate your risk of heart disease, to reduce the risk of heart disease.
What people are, I mean, some people are interested in the sciencey stuff, and then most people say, "Yeah, what can I do?"
Right. Maybe we can do that. We can do that
Yeah.
real quick. If you would provide a quick summary of what you can do, what
I'll do
reduces
my
your
best.
risk of heart disease and what increases the risk of heart disease. And next time we can talk about this more specifically and talk about why exactly this increases your risk and what exactly happens, why this reduces your risk.
Yeah. I think hopefully my bad throat will be gone by then.
Hopefully.
But hopefully. Anyway, nice to speak to you again. We'll rearrange. It's a very interesting discussion. It's helping me to make sure my thoughts are clear.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to have them questioned or attacked because that's what science is,
Right. And it's a difficult thing, by the way. It's not easy. It's not easy to get out of your own kind of bubble, because even if you don't want to, you want your ideas to be supported. That's kind of the human nature. You want to. And it's kind of going against human nature to say, I want to challenge my own ideas. That's not an easy thing to do, by no means.
And I think that, it's very important to say, well, what about this and what about that? And can you explain this and can you explain that? Because then that strengthens. There's nothing that strengthens anything more than being attacked and surviving that attack.
Right.
And
because your hypothesis, your model is only good enough if it's able to withstand any attack or any kind of criticism.
Yeah.
So that's why you do that. That's why you engage in that process in science. That's why you attack your hypothesis and question it all the time in order to see, is it consistent? Is it able to withstand all these attacks?
Yes. Well, if it's not a hypothesis.
Yeah, right.
And I don't want to start saying, oh, it's multifactorial, or it's a paradox, or
absolutely.
You have to say, well, actually, you've come up with a good issue. I'm not sure I can explain that.
Let me ask you a final question, because I'm curious. I would really love to do that and tell me what you think about it. If you would like to participate in some sort of debate between you, or not debate, conversation, discussion between you defending your views and your hypothesis, and someone who is in favor of the actual LDL hypothesis, and I would kind of try to mediate that discussion.
Well, that's right. I mean, I would say good luck. These are quite difficult things to do.
Absolutely.
I know that. But if you can pull it off, you've done a good job, because people become it's difficult not to be defensive.
But actually, really love to try it out, because I'm a little, like, not a little bit. I'm actually quite biased towards I just wanted to say the word belief, but I caught myself thinking about this word, not belief, in finding your hypothesis to make way more sense compared to the other one. And so I would love to see someone who doesn't think the way you think of these matters, and how this person would respond to what you say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if you can find someone who's willing to, I'm happy to have a go at it.
Right.
I think
I believe you can just try it out.
Oh, we can try it out, yeah.
And I believe it'll be helpful in terms of, you know, also challenging our own ideas, challenging the opposite ideas, and just trying to find common ground and see what we can agree and disagree on.
I'm going.
All right, Malcolm. All right. We can stop here.
Okay.
I wish you to recover real quickly, and
Thank you.
we talk again.
Okay.
Have a good time.